It began as a city of light, a jewel of the Pacific, and ended as a city of ashes. Manila, February 1945. What was once called the Pearl of the Orient became one of the most devastated capitals of the Second World War. In just 1 month, more than 100,000 civilians were slaughtered, entire districts erased, and centuries of culture turned to rubble. What unfolded in Manila was not just a battle, it was a tragedy of unimaginable scale, a convergence of vengeance, desperation, and human suffering that burned itself into the memory of nations. The war that had raged across oceans and jungles finally came to the heart of the Philippines, and what happened there would haunt history forever. For 3 long years, Manila had lived under the shadow of Japanese occupation. When the Imperial Army swept through Southeast Asia in 1942, the Philippines, then an American Commonwealth, was quickly overrun. General Douglas MacArthur, forced to withdraw, vowed his famous promise, "I shall return." The people of Manila endured occupation marked by starvation, repression, and fear, yet even in silence they held to hope that liberation would come. By late 1944, that hope began to take form. The Allies had retaken Leyte, and MacArthur's forces were advancing toward Luzon. The Japanese, however, refused to surrender. The stage was set for one of the fiercest urban battles of the Pacific War, a confrontation that would pit honor against vengeance, soldiers against civilians, and turn paradise into hell. In early February 1945, American forces, including the 1st Cavalry and 37th Infantry Divisions, entered the outskirts of Manila from the north. Expecting a swift liberation, they found instead a nightmare. The Japanese garrison, commanded by Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, defied orders to withdraw and vowed to defend the city to the last man. They transformed Manila's grand boulevards, cathedrals, and colonial mansions into fortresses. Every street a trap, every building a bunker. The city's proud Spanish-era architecture became a maze of fire and stone. As American tanks and infantry pushed forward, the Japanese fought from the shadows, using snipers, booby traps, and hidden artillery. What should have been a liberation turned into annihilation. Then came the civilians, caught between 2 armies, with nowhere to flee. The Japanese, cornered and enraged, unleashed a campaign of terror upon the population. Men were bayoneted in front of their families. Women and children were massacred by the thousands in schools, hospitals, and churches that had once symbolized peace. The Manila Massacre, as it would later be called, claimed tens of thousands of lives in scenes so horrific that even seasoned soldiers wept at what they found. The Bayview Hotel, St. Paul's College, and St. Scholastica's Convent became chambers of death. In the district of Intramuros, the walled heart of Old Manila, entire neighborhoods were leveled by artillery as both sides fought among the ruins. The screams of civilians echoed across the Pasig River as the city burned from end to end. American forces advanced street by street, often at the cost of immense destruction. Artillery and airstrikes reduced entire blocks to dust in the effort to dislodge the Japanese defenders. The battle raged for weeks, tanks rolling over cobblestones slick with rain and blood, soldiers fighting room to room in the remnants of colonial palaces. By early March, the fighting finally ended. Admiral Iwabuchi and nearly all his men were dead. The city that had once been called the Paris of Asia was gone. Its churches lay in ruins, its libraries burned, its people shattered. Manila was liberated, but at a price so terrible it defied the very meaning of victory. The aftermath was haunting. Over 100,000 civilians, more than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki, had been killed, most of them deliberately. The city itself, once the cultural heart of the Philippines, was reduced to ashes. American and Filipino troops wept as they walked through the rubble. Survivors wandered among the ruins, searching for loved ones who would never return. The liberation of Manila, though celebrated in history, remains one of the darkest chapters of the Pacific War, a grim reminder that even the fight for freedom can descend into horror when hatred and desperation consume the human soul. For Japan, the battle marked the end of its empire in the Philippines. For the Philippines, it marked a loss beyond repair. The destruction of its capital, its heritage, and a generation of its people. The ruins of Intramuros and the mass graves beneath the modern city remain silent, witnesses to the price of that liberation. The scars of Manila are not only written in stone and ash, but in memory, in the stories of those who lived and those who never returned. Tonight we walk through those shattered streets once more, through the smoke, the echoes, and the silence that followed. This is the story of the Battle of Manila, the day paradise became purgatory, and when the promise of liberation met the full horror of war. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? The first light of day slides over the Pasig River, turning its slow waters into sheets of gold. A ferry hums softly against the current, its captain, old Esteban Reyes, guiding it through the haze as church bells mark 6 o'clock. The air smells faintly of salt and sugar. Barges from Cavite have arrived with sacks of rice, and boys run barefoot along the wharf to unload them. The city stirs with rhythm, a choreography of calm. Manila, the pearl of the Orient, glows not with wealth alone, but with the warmth of its people, traders, teachers, musicians, mothers, each carrying the pulse of a young nation still under American rule. Above the streets, laundry flutters from balconies, pale against the dawn. On the riverbanks, fishermen mend their nets, joking softly in Tagalog, the words carried by mist. A tram rattles over the Jones Bridge, its wheels clanging in a steady, hopeful rhythm. The day unfolds slowly, like a curtain drawn back from a familiar stage. Few in the city pause to imagine that this same river will one day run dark with soot and silence. By mid-morning, Escalter Avenue thrums with life, the city's proud commercial spine. Streetcars painted cream and green hiss to a stop, their brass fittings glinting in the sun. Vendors call out prices for mangoes, hats, and cold sarsaparilla, while clerks in white suits hurry into offices, their shoes tapping against the tiled sidewalks. From open windows, jazz drifts out of gramophones imported from New York. There is laughter, polite bows, and the faint scent of burning tobacco leaves from a nearby cafe. Above them all, banners of English and Tagalog mingle, symbols of an uneasy but functioning harmony between empire and identity. A young teacher named Lilia Bautista pauses to buy a newspaper, its headline about the growing war in Europe, distant, abstract, unthreatening. The type is small, the letters foreign. The tram bell rings again, swallowing the thought. What no one knows is that within 4 years, these same streets will echo with gunfire instead of music. At noon, the heat settles like glass over the rooftops. Inside the walled city of Intramuros, cloistered nuns water bougainvillea as schoolchildren chant Latin lessons in the courtyards. The Manila Cathedral, rebuilt after the great earthquake of 1880, stands serene, its bells carrying through the still air. Father Ignacio, a priest from Batangas, wipes the sweat from his brow as he arranges candles for evening mass. Beyond the walls, horse-drawn calesas weave through the Plaza de Roma, their drivers calling out jokes in Spanish, English, and Tagalog, a living collage of colonial tongues. The scent of roasted peanuts and diesel drifts together, the smell of a city halfway between old world and modern. The light shifts gently on the cobblestones, tracing history with every passing cloud. Life, though humble, feels orderly, an unbroken pattern of prayer, trade, and family. But the pattern will break. The walls that once protected faith will soon trap the faithful inside. Outside Intramuros, new neighborhoods rise. Amita, Malate, San Miguel, each filled with the sound of typewriters and construction hammers. Art Deco cinemas display posters of Clark Gable and Carmen Rosales. Soldiers of the Philippine Scouts, in crisp khaki, watch from the sidewalks with quiet pride. Children play beneath acacia trees near the University of Santo Tomas, tossing rubber balls and shouting in 2 languages. In the evenings, the lamplighters walk the boulevards, one by one, igniting the gentle glow that gives the city its name. On the harbor, the American fleet rests at anchor, steel silhouettes against the horizon. Its sailors fill the bars and theaters, their laughter mingling with the voices of locals, 2 worlds sharing one fragile peace. Yet even among them, rumors drift like smoke. Japan's war machine rising in the north, Europe engulfed in fire. The warnings feel far away. No one imagines that these very ships will one day sail out to avenge what will soon be lost. In the cool interior of a cafe near Luneta Park, typewriters clack like mechanical birds. Journalists debate over cups of black coffee, their words heavy with politics, independence, sovereignty, the promise of a new republic. Outside, lovers stroll beneath gas lamps, the air tinged with the sea's quiet salt. The statue of José Rizal watches them, his bronze gaze turned toward the bay, where the sunset burns crimson against a calm horizon. Somewhere beyond that line lies a restless world, China, Singapore, Guam, each already feeling the tremors of conflict. But here in this twilight hour, peace still feels eternal. A gramophone needle drops, and Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade fills the cafe. The melody floats across tables, soft and untroubled. In a few years, the same melody will be played to drown out the sound of bombs. Night falls gently over Manila. The city glows, thousands of oil lamps reflecting on the river like stars trapped in water. Along the piers, dock workers rest their backs, their laughter carrying into the dark. Families dine on porridge and fried fish, the soft chatter of evening prayers drifting through bamboo walls. The Governor-General's mansion hums with orchestral music. Beyond its gates, barefoot children chase fireflies. From the clock tower of the post office, the bell tolls 9, deep and measured, echoing over the rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolls, though the sky is clear. The air holds a strange tension, almost imperceptible, a feeling of something vast approaching. The city dreams, but the storm is already on the horizon. Across the bay, in Japanese ports, ships are already being fueled and armed. Their steel hulls glisten under floodlights, their engines hum like waiting beasts. Maps of the Pacific are spread across tables, Manila marked with small red circles. The men who trace those lines speak softly, efficiently, as though planning the weather. They know the city's geography, its bridges, its vulnerable heart. Back in Manila, American officers stationed at Fort McKinley write letters home, believing their post to be safe. In the glow of a desk lamp, Lieutenant James Porter writes to his wife, describing the city as a gentle place, untouched by war. He seals the envelope with calm certainty. It will be the last letter he ever sends from Manila. The city sleeps beneath a dome of quiet stars. The wind carries the mingled scent of sea, stone, and jasmine. Somewhere a mother hums a lullaby, somewhere else a sentry yawns at his post. The river continues its patient flow, unhurried, indifferent. Time itself seems to pause, breathing in the stillness before history moves again. For all its lights, its laughter, and its grace, Manila does not yet know it stands at the edge of a vast darkness. The sound of the bells fades into the night, each chime an echo of a world about to vanish. The city hummed with life and music, unaware that soon the tide of the Pacific would turn its calm waters red. The first bombs fell without warning. It was December 8th, 1941, just 10 hours after Pearl Harbor, when the air above Manila tore open with the whine of engines. The Japanese 11th Air Fleet descended in tight formation, their Nakajima bombers glinting like silver knives in the morning sun. Below, children playing near Rizal Park looked up in confusion at the dots that shimmered overhead. Then the first explosions bloomed along Nichols Field, the shock waves rolling through the city like thunder. Windows shattered on Taft Avenue, smoke rose where once there had been song. American and Filipino troops scrambled for cover, rifles clattering against the pavement. In the chaos, a nurse named Amalia Torres helped carry the wounded through clouds of dust and glass. The air burned with cordite, with disbelief. Few understood that this single morning had ended an age and begun 3 years of occupation. By Christmas, the enemy had reached the city's edge. Japanese columns rolled south from Lingayen Gulf, their tanks growling down the highways like metal beasts. Civilians fled in droves, ox carts, bicycles, bare feet, pounding the dust. General Douglas MacArthur declared Manila an open city, hoping to spare it from destruction. But bombs do not read declarations. The bay filled with smoke as warehouses and piers burned. Ships sank one by one in slow, tragic silence. Soldiers of the Philippine Scouts held their lines along Bataan, their uniforms torn, their bodies hollowed by exhaustion. In the Intramuros district, families hid beneath staircases as the sky pulsed orange through the night. The sound of artillery echoed across the river, steady as a heartbeat. What they didn't yet know was that surrender would bring not safety, but servitude. On January 2nd, 1942, Japanese troops marched into Manila. They entered in perfect order. Columns of infantry in pressed khaki, bayonets gleaming in the sunlight, banners of the rising sun unfurled from city halls and telephone poles, red circles fluttering in a wind heavy with smoke. Loudspeakers blared Japanese anthems across Plaza Miranda as civilians stood frozen, unsure whether to bow or to run. In Escolta, shopkeepers watched silently as officers inspected their wares and marked certain storefronts with chalk symbols. At the post office, Japanese sentries replaced the American flag with their own, the fabric snapping sharply in the breeze. One by one, the landmarks of the old city were claimed, the courthouses, the schools, the airfields. In the shadow of these flags, the people lowered their voices and learned to speak carefully. The Pearl of the Orient had become a possession of the empire. Occupation remade everything. Food vanished first, rice rationed, bread replaced with root flour. Families queued for hours outside government depots under the watch of armed guards. The Japanese military administration imposed new currency, Mickey Mouse money, the locals called it, its paper value dissolving faster than trust. At night, curfew bells rang through the streets. Lamps went dark behind shuttered windows. Schoolrooms became barracks, chalkboards painted over with slogans of the new regime. Students recited lessons in Japanese. the sound of foreign syllables thick on their tongues. Yet beneath the surface, whispers travelled, coded notes passed in churches, radio fragments caught in secret. Hope, though faint, refused to die. But hope in wartime Manila would soon become a dangerous thing to hold. Resistance began in whispers and small acts. A printer named Ramoni Lagan hid leaflets beneath stacks of official notices. A teacher at the University of Santo Tomas used her chalkboard to draw hidden maps of guerrilla routes. Out in the countryside, Filipino fighters regrouped, remnants of defeated battalions turning to the mountains, calling themselves Hukbalaha. In the city, women traded information over baskets of vegetables, their voices low and calm. The Japanese Kempeitai, military police, learned to read fear in people's eyes. Arrests came at night, quietly with boots and whispers. Prisoners disappeared into Fort Santiago, a fortress now echoing with screams. What they didn't yet know was that these underground sparks would one day guide the Allied flame back to their shores. By 1943, the city had learned a new rhythm, one of silence. The tramlines still ran, but the laughter was gone. Posters proclaimed Asia for Asiatics, promising unity under Tokyo's rising sun. Yet in every face exhaustion lingered. The churches filled again, not with ceremony, but with desperation. Prayers for sons lost in Bataan, for daughters missing since dawn raids. Market stalls offered banana peel bread and diluted soy sauce. Even salt had become treasure. Still the bay shone deceptively calm at sunset, the waves reflecting banners and smoke in equal measure. The people adapted because survival demanded it, but in their eyes something had dimmed. Manila was learning to live without light. Far away, beyond the Pacific, the tide of war had begun to turn. At Guadalcanal, the Japanese had faltered. In Leyte Gulf, their ships burned beneath American air power. Rumors drifted into the city through smuggled radios. MacArthur had returned to the islands. The Allies were advancing north. Each whisper was a breath of life for the weary. But the occupation tightened in response. More checkpoints, more arrests, more fear. The people waited, counting days in hunger and silence. In the courtyards of Santo Tomas University, now an internment camp, foreign prisoners scratched calendars on the walls. They did not know it yet, but deliverance would come, and it would come like fire. As 1944 faded into 1945, the monsoon clouds returned. Rainwater pooled in the bomb craters, collecting the reflections of a broken city. The rising sun still hung over Manila, but its edges had begun to fray. Soldiers grew weary, patrols slower, discipline cracked. Civilians sensed the change, the way guards flinched at distant thunder, mistaking it for artillery. In the damp stillness of night, mothers whispered to their children that the Americans were coming back. Some believed, some only pretended to, but all waited, holding their breath between fear and faith. Manila endured beneath a paper-thin peace, waiting for deliverance that would come like fire. The sea was restless that morning off the coast of Leyte. Waves slapped against steel hulls as American landing craft bobbed in the shallows, their engines rumbling beneath a grey sky. General Douglas MacArthur stood near the ramp of one, cap fixed, corncob pipe steady, watching the shoreline draw nearer. Mortar shells fell in the distance, dull thuds swallowed by the roar of surf. When the ramp dropped, he stepped forward, into waist-deep water, boots sinking into sand, churned by war. Behind him, photographers clicked furiously, their shutters catching a moment, destined to outlive the battle itself. Filipino civilians and soldiers stood among the palms, waving and crying as he approached. The general lifted his hand in salute, face calm, the storm winds of history at his back. "People of the Philippines," he said, voice carried by radio and rumor alike, "I have returned." Few knew how dearly those 3 words would cost the islands in blood and fire. All around him, the machinery of liberation roared to life. LCVP landing craft poured men and supplies onto the beaches under a pale October sun. Sherman tanks lumbered inland through sucking mud. Their treads crushed coral and shell alike. The 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions advanced through coconut groves, rifles raised, as fighter planes screamed overhead. P-38, lightning streaking low, their twin engines humming like angry bees. Filipino guerrillas emerged from the tree line, guiding soldiers through back roads and river crossings known only to locals. Amid the thunder of artillery, they exchanged smiles, brief and wordless, the kind born from years of shared endurance. MacArthur watched from a command post, binoculars glinting in the light, his staff scribbling notes on wet maps. Every kilometer gained brought them closer to Manila, and to the memory of promises unfulfilled. What they didn't yet know was that each victory on Leyte would draw the Japanese closer to their last stand, in the heart of Manila itself. In the dense jungles of Samar, resistance fighters tuned battered radios by candlelight. Static hissed, crackled, then softened into a voice American, deliberate, unmistakable. "This is voice of freedom," it said, faint but clear enough to still hearts. "Hold fast, help is on the way." Men wept quietly in the dark. They had hidden for 3 years, hunted like animals, their rifles rusted but their resolve unbroken. Captain Antonio Season, a guerrilla leader, scribbled coordinates in a notebook before the frequency faded. Somewhere beyond the canopy, the night trembled with the low growl of distant bombers. To the north, signal fires flared, short, coded bursts of light that vanished into rain. For the first time since the occupation began, the resistance knew they were no longer alone. Hope had become a weapon again. For the Japanese garrisons, that same voice sounded like prophecy. In Manila, Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi read intelligence reports under a dim lantern, sweat beading on his temples. The words were simple but ominous. MacArthur landed, Leyte compromised. He ordered defenses strengthened, mines laid, civilians confined. In the corridors of the old legislative building, soldiers nailed shut the windows, muttering prayers to their ancestors. The occupation, once confident, began to fray. Across the islands, Japanese troops dug in, turning schools, convents, and homes into fortresses. Each bunker built was a confession that the tide had turned. Even as they prepared to die, they refused to yield. They believed surrender would shame the empire. No one imagined how that belief would devour a city. Meanwhile, the sea burned. At Leyte Gulf, the greatest naval battle of the Pacific unfolded. More than 200 warships locked in combat across 1,000 miles of ocean. The water shuddered under the impact of shells. The sky filled with the thunder of dive bombers. American F-6F Hellcats streaked down through smoke, machine guns spitting fire into Japanese decks. Kamikaze pilots, barely 20 years old, guided their planes into ships with terrifying precision. The USS Staint, erupted into flame, its bow lifting, before vanishing beneath the waves. Radio operators in Leyte listened helplessly to the crackling last words of entire crews. When it ended, the Japanese fleet lay in ruin, its fuel spent, its heart broken. But the survivors on land would make the islands themselves their final battlefield. In the jungles, the rain never stopped. It soaked rifles, uniforms, and bones alike. Soldiers trudged knee-deep through flooded paddies, their helmets slick with mud, leeches clinging to their legs. Filipino guides led them by instinct, avoiding patrol routes mapped from memory. Along the way, they passed villages where the people waited, silent, gaunt, but unbroken. Mothers pressed rice cakes into the hands of soldiers, blessings whispered in Tagalog and English. Children waved from behind bamboo fences, faces thin but eyes bright. In these moments, war felt less like conquest and more like reunion, a long exile ending in shared suffering. What none of them could see beyond the jungle's veil was that the road ahead would lead to Manila's destruction. By December 1944, the Allies had reclaimed much of Leyte. Airstrips rose from cleared fields. Supply ships anchored in the newly secured bay. From here the leap to Luzon was only a matter of time. MacArthur moved among the troops, his presence both burden and beacon. He spoke softly to wounded men, promising they would see their homes again. To his commanders he said little but pointed always north, toward the capital. Intelligence reports spoke of Japanese reinforcements fleeing from Baguio, of civilians starving in Manila's ruins. Each day, reconnaissance flights brought back photographs, bridges, gun placements, the empty streets of a city waiting in suspense. Hope had returned, but it carried the shadow of what liberation would require. The beaches of Leyte quieted as the sun set, the horizon a bruised line between sea and sky. Fires flickered from camp to camp, silhouettes of men cleaning weapons, writing letters, praying beneath the low drone of distant aircraft. In the shallow surf, waves whispered against discarded helmets. A young soldier from Batangas scribbled in his diary, "Tomorrow we move again. The general says we go home." Above him, MacArthur stood on a bluff, pipe glowing in the dusk, watching lightning dance far out at sea. Behind that storm lay Luzon, and beyond it, Manila, the city that still burned in memory, carrying the faintest echo of church bells from across the water, as if the city itself had heard his vow. The promise echoed across islands and seas, a promise soon to be fulfilled at unimaginable cost. Dawn broke in a roar of engines across the Lingayen Gulf. LCIs and LSTs, their hulls dark with salt, crept toward the beaches of northern Luzon. Overhead, swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts circled low, their propellers chopping humid air into a relentless hum. The sea, glassy and still before sunrise, churned now with the weight of invasion. On the decks, soldiers tightened straps and checked their rifles in silence. A sergeant from Ohio fingered a worn photograph of his wife before tucking it into his breast pocket. When the ramps dropped, the first waves splashed ashore beneath a curtain of smoke. The sand was soft and hot, even through their boots, littered with fragments of coral and shell casings from naval bombardment. Along the ridgeline, palm trees burned like torches against a pale sky. The men fanned out, hearts pounding, the word Luzon echoing like a promise fulfilled. What they didn't yet know was that the road to Manila would demand more from them than any beach ever could. The land itself seemed to resist them. Convoys rolled through narrow, dust-choked roads bordered by rice paddies and shattered villages. The January sun beat down mercilessly, turning helmets into furnaces and sweat into rivulets of mud. Sherman tanks growled ahead, their treads grinding against stone bridges rebuilt in haste. Every mile required engineers to clear mines, patch culverts, and haul supply trucks from ditches. Filipino farmers watched from the fields, waving flags made from torn bedsheets, the red and blue colors hand-stitched, the sunburst uneven but bright. At crossroads, guerrilla scouts emerged to guide the columns, their rifles slung across their backs. Their local knowledge saved hours, sometimes lives. cutting paths through hills the Americans had never mapped. As the convoys climbed the ridges of Pangasinan, the air grew thin and still. The smell of diesel and mango leaves mingled in strange harmony. No one imagined that this same air would soon carry the scent of burning cities. In the skies above, the war unfolded in thunder. Formations of B-25 Mitchell bombers droned southward, engines vibrating like the heartbeat of the invasion. Below them stretched a patchwork of jungle and farmland, speckled with the faint silver of rivers and the dark scars of retreating Japanese columns. Pilots called out targets in clipped radio bursts, rail lines, trucks, bridges. Explosions bloomed across the valleys, followed by columns of black smoke rising like warnings to the horizon. Anti-aircraft bursts dotted the sky in brief, futile flashes. In the rear seats, gunners squinted through plexiglass, their hands trembling from hours of vibration. One could see Manila Bay far in the distance, a faint glint beyond the haze, unreachable but near enough to taste. Each mile forward was measured in fuel, ammunition, and bodies. And yet, beneath that sound of conquest, the whisper of the dead was already forming. The Japanese defense of Luzon was scattered but fanatical. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, had chosen not to defend Manila itself. Instead, he withdrew his main forces north to the mountains, hoping to rain and time would grind the Americans down. In his absence, smaller garrisons clung to every town and crossroads. Determined to fight to the last, ambushes flared along jungle trails, a burst of machine gun fire, a grenade tossed from the brush, then silence again. For U.S. infantrymen, every shadow concealed a sniper, every hut a potential trap. The terrain consumed speed. What should have been hours of advance stretched into days. Filipino guides pointed out old paths carved before the war, routes that bypassed Japanese strongholds. MacArthur's staff pressed onward regardless, driven by the promise made on Leyte's beaches. They believed the road to Manila would end in triumph. None foresaw how it would twist through tragedy first. Villages rose from the dust as the columns moved south. In each one, liberation came as both joy and disbelief. Children ran barefoot beside armored trucks, shouting Mabuhay, while women handed fruit and water to exhausted soldiers. A priest blessed them with trembling hands, the air heavy with incense and gunpowder. Old men bowed, whispering names of sons taken years before. At dusk, the soldiers bivouacked near rivers, their campfires flickering like scattered constellations across the valley floor. Radios played faint swing tunes from San Francisco, warped and hollow in the humid air. Some danced, others simply stared into the flames. In those moments the war felt far away, a rumor that might finally be ending. But the next dawn always reminded them that peace was still beyond the mountains. Further south, reconnaissance patrols reported fierce resistance near the town of Bamban. Japanese units had fortified caves along the Zambales Mountains, their machine guns hidden behind layers of rock. Artillery thundered for hours, shaking the ground like an unending drum. When the infantry advanced, they found tunnels honeycombed with defenders who refused to surrender. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the acrid tang of cordite. Medics crawled through craters to pull the wounded out by their belts. A lieutenant named James Nolan led his platoon through a ravine, only to be met by a grenade at his feet. By dusk, fewer than half his men remained. Above them, vultures circled in the humid twilight. The surviving troops buried their dead in shallow graves marked with rifle stocks. And though the battle moved on, the island seemed to absorb each name into its soil. By late January, the push toward the capital quickened. Columns converged on the central plain, dust hanging like fog above endless convoys. Tanks rolled side by side with ox carts, their steel hulls reflecting the orange glow of sunset. The 1st Cavalry Division raced ahead, their orders clear: reach Manila before the enemy could destroy it. Along the roadside, civilians stood silently, some cheering, others simply watching, unsure whether this advance meant salvation or another storm. MacArthur's command jeep passed through the line, his expression unreadable, the brim of his cap shadowing his eyes. His men saw only resolve, but within him burned an impatience sharpened by memory. Each passing village reminded him of what had been lost, and what waited to be reclaimed. He thought only of the city ahead, not yet of what war would make of it. Night fell over Luzon with a stillness that felt almost sacred. Engines idled low, and men slept beside their rifles, under a sky scattered with stars. In the distance, faint artillery flashes marked the line where the next day's battles would begin. A gentle wind moved through the palms, carrying the smell of dust, diesel, and wet grass. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Manila's lights flickered, dim, uncertain, alive. A young Filipino scout whispered to a fellow soldier, "We'll see it tomorrow." Neither knew what sight awaited them. The road that had begun in triumph would end in ruin. Every mile now was a heartbeat closer to the heart of the storm. Every mile won on Luzon brought them closer to the heart of a dying city. The northern suburbs of Manila trembled under the low rumble of distant artillery. American tanks moved along narrow roads, treads chewing through rubble, left from years of neglect and sabotage. Infantry advanced, rifles tight against chests, eyes scanning windows and rooftops. Sandbags were stacked hastily in cathedral doorways, pale stone obscured by hasty defenses. Inside, civilians crouched beneath pews, the air heavy with the smell of kerosene and fear. Lieutenant James Kearney of the 1st Infantry wiped sweat from his brow, hearing only the metallic clink of shell casings hitting sandbags. Somewhere nearby, a Japanese officer barked orders through a bullhorn, voice carrying over the hollow streets. Manila had become a city of preparation, a trap waiting for its prey. Children shivered beneath stairs, clutching each other, unsure whether the enemy was outside or inside. What they didn't yet know was that every street, every bridge, every home had been turned into a potential tomb. Bridges across the Pasig were wired with explosives. Engineers crawled beneath them, their hands tracing detonator wires as electric sparks danced faintly across copper coils. Soldiers above stood at attention, rifles ready, listening for any sign of movement in the shadows. Across the city, barricades turned homes into fortresses. Furniture was nailed into windows, and doorways braced with reinforced timbers. Japanese snipers moved through second-story windows, rifles calibrated for maximum reach. The scent of oil, sweat, and gunpowder mingled in the humid air. Civilians whispered prayers beneath stairwells, some clutching rosaries, some simply staring at walls painted with soot from previous bombings. Young men hid weapons beneath floorboards, knowing discovery meant certain death. Macabre murals of life and survival had emerged, invisible from above but lethal to those who moved. No one imagined this would become a city where every heartbeat counted as a gamble. At the University of Santo Tomas, converted into a Japanese command post, officers marked positions on a map. Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi traced the streets with a ruler, counting blocks between the river and Intramuros. His eyes, dark behind spectacles, scanned reports of civilian movement, their existence both shield and hostage. Soldiers lugged sandbags into chapels and libraries, reinforcing them for snipers and machine guns. Outside, the wind carried shouts of civilians, low and cautious, while the occasional shot rang out from an empty street. Sister Maria, a nun pressed into service, clutched a crucifix and whispered to the women sheltering in the basement. The faint flicker of candlelight cast long shadows on faces drawn by hunger and dread. Everything had been converted, homes, offices, even hospitals, into instruments of defense. Manila was no longer a city. It was a labyrinth of danger, scent of smoke and fear thick in the air. What they didn't yet know was that these defenses would make every step forward a step into hell. In Quiapo, civilians were pressed into kitchens and cellars. Kerosene lamps swung gently, their smell masking the stench of damp and unwashed bodies. Children, faces streaked with dust and tears, were hushed by mothers who dared not raise their voices. Japanese soldiers patrolled silently above, bayonets glinting, eyes sharp for movement. Windows were shuttered. Streets were empty, except for patrolling units. Occasionally, a dog barked in warning, a sound immediately silenced by the careful step of a soldier. In the alleys, scorched motorcycles lay abandoned, reminders of sudden evacuations and panic. Elderly men muttered histories of past sieges, attempting to comfort the young, though their own hearts were hammering. Outside, American artillery hummed faintly across the horizon, an unknowing lullaby to those trapped inside. And yet the people waited for mercy, for madness, for the end. Across the river in Binondo, Japanese soldiers reinforced key intersections. Sandbags, barrels, and twisted steel blocked access to main roads. Civilians carrying water or food moved like ghosts, crouched behind walls, eyes down. Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi directed the placement of mines, testing wires with meticulous care. Soldiers trained their rifles on windows, doors, and rooftops, anticipating the first steps of the approaching Allied forces. Smoke rose from small fires, where supply crates were burned to hide evidence of movement. The scent of gun oil and wet concrete hung in the humid air. A merchant named Raphael stood frozen behind a collapsed wall, counting each breath as though it might be his last. Every movement carried the weight of survival and death. No one imagined that this preparation would make the city itself a weapon against its own people. In Intramuros, the ancient walls were transformed into bastions. Churches, once symbols of faith, now bristled with rifle ports and sandbagged windows. Soldiers crawled along narrow parapets, their hands raw from rope and wire. Beneath them, civilians crouched in cellars, the smell of mold and kerosene thick enough to taste. Japanese officers inspected corridors, their fingers tracing maps and measuring lines of fire. Outside, the streets seemed to hold their breath, empty but alive with threat. Smoke drifted from distant suburbs, remnants of skirmishes and sabotage. The sound of artillery in the distance was a constant undercurrent, a low drum of inevitability. Every block became a trap, every corner a potential ambush. The city was alive with anticipation, and every shadow carried a story of dread. Along the northern approaches, the Allies advanced cautiously. Reconnaissance patrols crept forward through banana groves and narrow streets, rifles up, eyes sharp for the glint of a rifle barrel or the flash of a tripwire. Japanese snipers tracked them from rooftops, their breaths steady, fingers poised on triggers. Mines hidden in potholes and debris made every step a gamble. Soldiers whispered each other's names as they moved, a fragile talisman against fear. Civilians watched silently, hearts clenched, unsure whether salvation had arrived or disaster. Trucks rumbled past, their engines muffled by anticipation and tension. The smell of wet earth and oil mixed with faint smoke from distant artillery. It was a city waiting, a city ready. Every inch gained carried the weight of human cost, not yet counted. Night fell, and Manila became a city of shadows. Kerosene lamps burned low in cellars. Sandbags gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Soldiers in apartments above listened for every footstep. Children shivered beneath stairs, clutching siblings, imagining the world beyond the walls. The wind carried the faint scent of river water, mingling with smoke and damp. In the distance, artillery hummed, approaching, receding, never-ending. Civilians whispered prayers, soldiers whispered names, and somewhere Admiral Iwabuchi studied maps once more. The city was tense, alive with waiting, every moment pregnant with consequence. Behind every shuttered window, someone waited for mercy, for madness, for the end. The first shots echoed across the Pasig River before dawn. Artillery thundered, sending shock waves that rattled windows and dusted the streets with plaster. The 1st Cavalry Division advanced cautiously, their boots sloshing through waterlogged banks, rifles ready. Small boats ferried engineers and infantry across currents swollen by the monsoon. On the northern bridges, Japanese machine gunners fired from sandbagged parapets, their bullets tearing the air with sharp, metallic cries. Corporal Henry Thompson shouted over the noise, signaling a squad to flank a ruined warehouse. Civilians perched on rooftops waved white cloths, some trembling, some resolute, the symbols of surrender, fragile against the cacophony. Smoke rose in ribbons from the shattered suburbs. The river reflected fire in flickering streaks. Manila was no longer a city waiting. It was a city at war. What they didn't yet know was that every step forward carried them deeper into a trap of their own hopes. Shattered bridges collapsed under flame and weight. Engineers scrambled along girders, ropes tied to hulls of jeeps and amphibious vehicles, trying to secure a crossing. Explosions from hidden charges threw water and debris skyward. Soldiers ducked instinctively, dragging wounded comrades behind concrete barricades. From the opposite bank, Japanese snipers took aim, their barrels shining in the flickering light. Every shot rang with precision, every missed bullet a heartbeat closer to chaos. Filipino guerrillas emerged from alleys to guide American troops through the maze of ruins. Overhead, reconnaissance planes traced patterns of fire and smoke, feeding coordinates back to artillery batteries on the outskirts. Amid this, a medic named Luis Herrera carried a child past crumbling walls, her eyes wide with terror. No one imagined this would become a battle for survival rather than liberation. The 37th Infantry Division moved through Quiapo, every street a gauntlet. Windows had been boarded with furniture and scrap metal. Doorways bristled with rifles. Japanese officers shouted commands in short bursts of Japanese, gesturing to hold positions at all costs. Sergeant William Connors advanced alongside Filipino fighters, their local knowledge guiding him past tripwires hidden beneath rubble. Mortar shells exploded nearby, throwing bricks and dust into the humid air. Civilians pressed against walls, some hiding behind carts of rice, others gripping children with white-knuckled hands. The scent of gun oil mixed with wet earth and kerosene. A priest called from a bombed-out church for silence and prayer, his voice trembling but defiant. Smoke rose from a bakery turned barricade, loaves burned but the oven still faintly warm. And yet, every street cleared revealed another challenge waiting. Across the Pasig, artillery fire shifted from long-range to street-by-street engagement. A Sherman tank rumbled along Escolta Avenue, its treads crushing pavement and debris alike. Machine gun fire bounced off steel, ricocheted across walls, and slammed into abandoned shops. Lieutenant Arthur Blake directed his men to suppress a sniper in a crumbling bank, signaling with hand gestures. Japanese soldiers fired from basements and rooftops, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. Civilians, many trapped in these homes, waved white flags from broken windows, their arms shaking. The 37th's radio crackled with static, a voice cutting through the chaos. Hold position until artillery clears. The smell of burning wood, cordite, and human fear combined into a tangible haze. Even the river, calm for decades, churned with echoes of destruction. What they didn't yet know was that every crossing, every alley would exact a price they could not yet measure. Amid the chaos, small acts of humanity persisted. A Filipino woman slipped water to a wounded American soldier beneath a collapsed wall. Corporal Thompson returned the gesture with a bandage, eyes meeting hers for a brief, fleeting second. Across the street, a guerrilla fighter named Emilio Cruz guided children to a hidden cellar, whispering instructions over the roar of artillery. Soldiers paused for moments that felt like eternity, to breathe, to pray, to witness life continuing amid ruin. The sound of distant gunfire blended with the cries of the city, a symphony of survival. Explosions lit the horizon in intermittent bursts, throwing shadows across rubble-strewn plazas. Even as smoke clouded vision, determination held steady in every unit. The Pasig had become a lifeline and a barrier all at once. And still, hope flickered, fragile and persistent, against the roar of destruction. Japanese resistance hardened in the heart of the city. Admiral Iwabuchi's officers coordinated pockets of defense, every street corner a choke point. Mines hidden beneath tiles and rubble tore through advancing tanks, slowing momentum to a crawl. Soldiers lay in wait above collapsed buildings, firing only when necessary to conserve ammunition. The roar of artillery only fueled their resolve, the sound a signal to hold. Civilians, trapped in basements, clutched each other and listened to the distant shouts, uncertain who might save them or harm them next. Smoke from burned-out vehicles lingered, creating a haze in which even experienced troops struggled to see enemy positions. Each room cleared, each alley gained, was measured not in distance, but in lives. No one imagined this would become a siege of the living, with the city itself as weapon. By afternoon, the battle spread along both banks of the river. A young scout named Miguel Santos ran between positions, relaying messages from guerrillas to American officers. Tanks hammered into fortified barricades, their 75mm guns splintering walls and igniting fires. Snipers hidden in the skeletons of schools and offices picked targets with eerie calm. Civilians pressed white cloths to windows, some praying, some screaming, some motionless in fear. Engineers diffused explosives while mortars lobbed shells across rooftops, shaking foundations and nerves alike. The sound of splintering timber, exploding concrete, and shouted orders created a landscape of chaos. Yet methodically, the lines advanced. Every step was earned with coordination, courage, and loss. And beneath it all, the city waited, tense and unbroken, for what was coming next. As night fell, Manila's skyline was a jagged silhouette of smoke and fire. Bridges sagged into the river, tanks idled, and the artillery grew quieter, though the hum of distant gunfire never ceased. Civilians huddled in basements, alleyways, and bombed-out homes, listening to the occasional crackle of the river against shattered masonry. Soldiers marked positions, counted the wounded, whispered names, and prayed quietly for tomorrow. The Pasig itself reflected flames, the water carrying both light and shadow downstream. For a moment, liberation seemed close, a crossing of hope into reality. Yet every glance at the city revealed new hazards, new traps, new pockets of resistance. The streets were alive with tension, each heartbeat a warning, each breath a gift. What began as liberation would soon unravel into ruin. Shells screamed across the sky, striking the ancient walls of Intramuros with bone-shaking force. Corporal James Holden ducked behind a broken balustrade as a fragment of stone shattered nearby, dust and shards raining across his helmet. The 37th Infantry pressed forward, rifles ready, boots crunching over rubble and charred timber. Inside the cathedral, Father Lorenzo murmured prayers, voice trembling beneath the deafening percussion of artillery. Children clutched rosaries, candlelight trembling across wide, fearful eyes. Smoke coiled in the narrow streets, carrying the smell of gunpowder, wet stone, and burning wood. A Japanese machine gun rattled from a collapsed palace window, its fire cutting through the thick haze. Outside the walls, Sherman tanks fired into fortified doorways, each shell sending tremors through centuries of history. Manila's old city was alive with fear, with resistance, with survival. What they didn't yet know was that each blast would tear not just walls, but the heart of a people. Soldiers moved cautiously along coal rail, stepping over debris and overturned carts. Private Luis Martinez guided his squad past the rubble of the Ayuntamiento, eyes scanning for movement above and below. A sniper fired from the roof of a bombed convent, the bullet shattering masonry beside him. Civilians hid in cellars, their breaths shallow, listening to stones fall like rain. Father Lorenzo led a prayer group, whispering the Lord's words while dust filled every corner. Outside, a Sherman 75mm gun thundered, knocking a section of wall into the street. Windows exploded in sparks of glass, and the scent of smoke mixed with incense from the chapel. A child's cry pierced the gunfire, echoing off the stoned streets, answered only by the murmur of prayers. No one imagined this would become a place where sanctuary and slaughter existed side by side. Japanese defenders held every alley, every stairwell, with ruthless precision. Sergeant Takeda, crouched behind a toppled wall, calibrated his rifle for a clear shot at advancing troops. Molotov cocktails and hand grenades littered the streets, ready to turn even the smallest building into a furnace. The Americans responded with flamethrowers and bazookas, fire licking through timber, smoke curling into the sky. Across the plaza, civilians pressed faces to cracks in the stone walls, watching their world crumble. Manila's ancient cobblestones were slick with rain, blood, and oil. Artillery crews adjusted their range with painstaking care, shells arcing perfectly before crashing into defensive positions. Soldiers exchanged glances, communicating silently. Every movement could mean life or death. The smell of cordite and burned wood became as familiar as the acrid tang of fear. What they didn't yet know was that the city itself would become both battlefield and victim. From atop the fortifications, Lieutenant James Connor observed the chaos. The rooftops were a chessboard of fire and shadow. Soldiers maneuvering while civilians darted to safety. Smoke plumes rose like fingers reaching for the sky, twisting around bell towers and collapsed gates. A priest guided a group of women and children down a ruined stairwell, their feet slipping on wet stone. Mortar rounds fell nearby, throwing masonry into clouds of dust. The scent of gunpowder and damp stone filled Connor's lungs, a metallic taste lingering on his tongue. Inside an old palace, Japanese officers barked orders, each movement precise, each gesture deadly. Civilians prayed silently for someone to end the madness, someone to spare them from the coming inferno. Overhead, P-38s droned low, strafing suspected gun positions. No one imagined how quickly a city of centuries could be reduced to ash and terror. Fire consumed the streets, advancing like a living thing. Private Martinez ducked beneath a fallen beam as flames leapt from house to house, igniting furniture, papers, and rooftops. Civilians ran through alleys with soaked blankets over children, their faces streaked with soot and tears. Sherman tanks rumbled behind infantry, shells cracking walls and igniting debris in cascading showers of sparks. Japanese snipers disappeared into the smoke only to reappear moments later, picking targets with unerring calm. Church bells that had tolled for centuries now rang no more, their towers scarred and hollow. Explosions shook the ground, sending bricks and dust into the humid air. The smell of burning wood and human fear mingled in thick, choking clouds. Each step forward required courage, calculation, and heartbreak. And still, every corner held the possibility of life, or the certainty of death. By evening, the walled city had become a labyrinth of destruction. Firelight reflected off broken cobblestones, flickering across walls, pockmarked with shell and bullet holes. Soldiers advanced cautiously, moving from alley to alley, stairwell to stairwell. Father Lorenzo guided a group through a bombed convent, their prayers mingling with the low hum of artillery. Children clutched rosaries as smoke stung their eyes and soot coated their skin. Japanese defenders, trapped but resolute, used every floorboard, every doorway, every corridor as an advantage. Mortars lobbed shells across rooftops, shaking the foundations of centuries-old buildings. Civilians pressed themselves into niches, holding each other, whispering names, recounting memories in the midst of ruin. Every movement carried both hope and fear. What they didn't yet know was that Intramuros would bleed before it could breathe again. Amid the rubble, small acts of resistance and humanity persisted. A nurse, Maria Santos, wrapped a young boy in a blanket as bullets chipped plaster around her. Soldiers paused for a moment to shield a family fleeing a burning alleyway. The roar of tanks and the whistle of shells became background to whispered prayers. Japanese officers moved silently, calculating, enforcing every rule of defense. Flames licked through the cathedral doors, smoke curling into the sky, obscuring sun and stars alike. Private Holden helped an elderly man to his feet, guiding him past shattered benches and scorched icons. The city, though burning, remained inhabited by courage and grief alike. Every alley, every ruined building, carried the weight of lives suspended between hope and despair. No one imagined how deeply fear and bravery could intertwine in a single moment. Night descended, and Intramuros was a city of shadows and fire. Flames illuminated collapsing walls and toppled bell towers, the orange glow flickering across streets choked with rubble. Civilians whispered prayers while soldiers cleaned weapons, their eyes reflecting candlelight and smoke. The smell of burning wood, wet stone, and fear hung in the humid air. Explosions in the distance punctuated the darkness, a rhythm of destruction without mercy. Father Lorenzo led the last prayers of the evening, voice steady despite trembling hands. Children pressed close, their rosaries clutched like talismans. Tanks rested behind ruined walls, engines idling softly, awaiting the next day's advance. Stone by stone, the soul of the city came undone. Flames ripped through the rooftops of Sampaloc before dawn, casting an orange glare that illuminated the river's surface. Corporal Miguel Reyes ran along a narrow alley, the soles of his boots scorched by embers and fallen tiles. Mothers clutched children beneath collapsing roofs, whispering lullabies to quiet the sound of distant artillery. Smoke billowed from every corner, curling around bell towers and shattered homes, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and gunpowder. The Pasig churned with debris, splintered furniture, broken beams, and bodies of those who had dared escape too late. Japanese defenders continued sniping from windows, each shot a frozen moment of terror. The first cavalry advanced slowly, artillery suppressing enemy positions, their shells shaking foundations built centuries ago. Civilians ran from one makeshift shelter to another, their eyes wide, faces streaked with soot and tears. Even in this inferno, small acts of care persisted. A water bottle passed, a blanket shared, a hand held. What they didn't yet know was that the city's nights would grow brighter than the sun, yet no one would live to see peace. Along Escolta Avenue, the sound of collapsing walls drowned out all other noise. Private James Nolan crawled through a building whose walls had buckled under a Sherman shell. Rubble clung to his uniform, dust filling his lungs with every breath. Civilians huddled in corners, pressing their faces to stone and wood as if it could shield them from the raw outside. A mother sang softly to her infant, her voice trembling but steady, while a grenade crater widened near her feet. Japanese soldiers had fortified every building with barricades, traps, and makeshift explosives, turning homes into ovens of destruction. Firefighters from the pre-war Manila Brigade tried to douse flames, but hoses were scarce, engines sputtered, and water pressure failed. Smoke turned night into day, obscuring movements and amplifying panic. Soldiers communicated with hand signals, coordinating sweeps through labyrinthine streets. Every advance was measured not in yards, but in the lives preserved or lost along the way. No one imagined this would become a city where time itself seemed to pause in grief. The riverside districts became a corridor of suffering. Corpses floated among debris in the murky waters, their limbs tangled with fallen furniture and shattered beams. Filipino guerrillas waded carefully, trying to pull survivors to safety, their uniforms soaked in filth and blood. Japanese snipers perched in ruined warehouses fired intermittently, ensuring that even the water offered no refuge. Ammunition belts rattled, tanks fired at fortified walls, and artillery shells tore up streets that had once hosted markets and festivals. Children cried out, their small voices swallowed by the roar of destruction. Amid it all, Father Lorenzo led a prayer from a half-collapsed bridge, voice barely audible over gunfire. Smoke clung to his robes as he motioned civilians to follow a safer path downstream. Volunteers carried the wounded to sandbagged makeshift hospitals, each footstep a balance between hope and peril. What they didn't yet know was that the river itself had become a mirror of the city's anguish. Bombs fell near the university district, turning classrooms into tombs. Corporal Luis Mendoza crawled through the debris of a lecture hall, finding textbooks singed and scattered. Mothers shielded children beneath desks, whispering prayers in Tagalog and Spanish. The smell of cordite and burning paper filled the humid air, mixing with the scent of wet stone and human sweat. Japanese machine guns cut across streets, forcing American troops to advance in short, measured bursts. Small firestorms consumed market stalls, their produce igniting and sending sparks into the sky. Civilians carried water in buckets, forming human chains that stretched across streets, littered with rubble. Mortars fired from rooftops exploded against barricades, shaking walls and ceilings as dust rained down. Each step forward required courage, calculation, and the endurance of grief. No one imagined classrooms could become crucibles of both learning and horror. Night fell over Malat, and fire transformed it into a living inferno. Flames licked the facades of stately homes, consuming roofs and furniture in seconds. Civilians scrambled across alleys, dragging children and salvaging what little remained. The scent of burning kerosene mingled with blood and wet earth. Soldiers paused only briefly to shield the fleeing, then pressed on, rifles raised and eyes scanning for threats. Japanese defenders melted into shadows, reappearing moments later to inflict maximum casualties. A nurse, Carmen Rivera, carried a child past a smoldering bakery, soot streaked across her face. Each heartbeat echoed with fear, each breath was measured against survival. Smoke illuminated ruins, painting the streets with a surreal orange glow. What they didn't yet know was that the month ahead would become a crucible of endurance and despair. The old cathedral became both sanctuary and prison. Father Lorenzo guided the trapped civilians into the crypt, stone steps slick with dust and blood. Candles flickered in the dark, revealing the wide eyes of children clinging to rosaries. Outside, mortar shells shook the walls, dislodging stones that fell like thunder into the nave. Civilians whispered names, recounted memories, and prayed for mercy that seemed far away. A young man named Thomas kept watch at the door, rifle in hand, heart hammering with fear and determination. Smoke seeped in through shattered windows, acrid and suffocating. Soldiers outside moved cautiously, protecting those who could be rescued, each step a negotiation with death. Flames illuminated the belfry, each ring of light casting shadows that danced like spectres. No one imagined the sanctuary of faith could become a corridor of suffocating terror. By mid-month, Manila had become unrecognizable. Markets, homes, and schools were charred skeletons. Streets were rivers of ash and mud. Civilians scavenged cautiously, searching for food, water, or family members amid ruins. Snipers and machine guns controlled every avenue, every alley, every staircase. Engineers diffused improvised explosives in the remnants of once bustling plazas. Soldiers whispered names of the fallen, carried the wounded, and advanced street by street. Aware that every gain exacted a human toll, smoke hung thick in the air, reducing visibility to mere meters. The scent of burning wood and fear permeated every structure. Artillery continued to thunder, relentless, as if the city itself were a target. What they didn't yet know was that survival was becoming both miracle and curse. As February ended, the nights no longer brought darkness, only fire. Fires blazed across rooftops, illuminating crumbled walls and shattered lives. Mothers held children close, whispering lullabies that competed with the roar of artillery. Soldiers rested for moments in alleyways, weapons in hand, faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. The Pasig carried debris downstream, reflecting the orange glow of ruin. A young girl, Maria Luz, clutched a rosary as she pressed herself against a collapsed wall, eyes wide with disbelief. Smoke and ash mingled with the scent of wet stone and human grief. Every breath was heavy with loss, every movement weighed by memory. Manila had become both battlefield and graveyard. The nights were no longer dark. They burned with the color of loss. Flames licked the rooftops of hospitals and convents along the Pasig's edge, smoke twisting into the grey sky. Sister Teresa clutched a child against her chest as a machine gun spat fire across a crumbling street. The acrid stench of burning wood and flesh filled every corner of the city, mingling with dust and wet stone. Civilians huddled in basements, pressing themselves into walls, listening to screams that ricocheted like shards of glass. Private William Harris moved cautiously along a street lined with debris, rifle ready, eyes scanning every doorway. Japanese soldiers torched the Bay District, dragging those who resisted into alleyways. Mothers whispered prayers, clutching rosaries, faces streaked with soot and tears. A hospital ward collapsed under incendiary fire, patients trapped beneath timber and masonry, smoke reflected in the river, orange ribbons undulating across the water. What they didn't yet know was that the city's heartbeat had become a pulse of terror. The cries of the wounded carried across empty plazas. Corporal Luis Mendoza guided a small group of civilians past a collapsed marketplace, the scent of cordite clinging to his uniform. Streets were littered with furniture, shattered carts, and discarded belongings, each object a marker of interrupted life. Japanese soldiers advanced systematically, firing into homes, dragging men and boys into shadowed alleys. Children pressed to floors, barely breathing, hearts hammering against chests. Tanks rumbled along ruined roads, shells exploding into barricades. Adding to the cacophony, a priest, Father Gabriel, led survivors to a crypt beneath a bombed church. Voice barely audible over the chaos, civilians held one another, whispering names and prayers, their bodies pressed close against stone. Fires blazed along rooftops, consuming centuries-old timber in seconds. No one imagined this would become a theater of human suffering, calculated and merciless. In the San Miguel district, death moved with a chilling rhythm. Japanese soldiers entered homes, their boots echoing across shattered floors, bayonets ready, families hid in cupboards, under beds, behind walls. Yet the search was methodical, unrelenting. Corporal Hernandez carried the wounded through narrow alleys, dodging flying debris and the occasional burst of gunfire. Smoke and flames twisted through the streets, painting everything in shades of orange and grey. Mothers pressed children to their chests, whispering lullabies into ears that could scarcely hear. A warehouse became a temporary refuge, but artillery shells reduced walls to rubble within minutes. Civilians' faces reflected fear, disbelief, and exhaustion. Tanks fired into fortified positions, the concussion shaking walls and windows for blocks. What they didn't yet know was that the city's suffering would peak before relief could arrive. Along the bay, the fires spread to merchant warehouses. Sailors and dock workers had long since abandoned the docks, leaving goods to burn and smolder. Japanese troops moved systematically, torches in hand, ensuring that nothing remained untouched. Children watched from distant alleys, too afraid to move, too young to understand the full scale of destruction. The river carried charred debris downstream, mingling with the occasional body that floated past. American artillery, in the distance, tried to suppress enemy positions, but shells could not reach every hidden room, every fortified doorway. Civilians scrambled across streets, some slipping in ash and blood. Father Lorenzo, guiding a group of survivors, noted names, faces, ages, a mental ledger of the living amidst ruin. Smoke and fire coiled across the night sky, reflected in shattered windows. No one imagined this would become a city scorched both in stone and in memory. In the burned-out quarter of Ermita, horror found every corner. Sister Maria held a blanket over a small group of children, whispering soft prayers against the roar of gunfire. Japanese soldiers methodically set fire to houses, dragging out any civilians who resisted. Explosions tore through streets, sending masonry and furniture into the air. Private Robert Kane moved cautiously, noting the smell of cordite and burning flesh. Civilians fled along alleys, pressed against walls, sliding over rubble as mortar shells detonated nearby. The river beyond carried smoke and embers downstream, a grim reflection of the city above. Mothers held infants close, whispering lullabies into ears filled with soot and terror. Artillery roared intermittently, each salvo echoing like the heartbeat of the battle. What they didn't yet know was that no one would leave this month unscarred. Hospitals had become tombs and fortresses simultaneously. Surgeons and nurses worked amid shattered walls, attempting to tend wounds by candlelight. Civilians crawled across floors to reach safety, their limbs scratched and bloodied. Japanese soldiers fired from rooftops, taking aim at anyone who dared move. Private Luis Ortega carried a wounded girl beneath a collapsed doorway, soot streaked across his face. Smoke choked corridors, carrying the smell of burning wood, flesh, and oil. Bell towers groaned under repeated artillery, stones raining into streets below. Mothers clutched children in basements, whispering names, praying for deliverance. Tanks rolled down streets cleared of barricades, the ground shaking beneath each passage. No one imagined how quickly sanctuaries could become scenes of horror. By mid-February, the city was unrecognizable. The streets, once bustling, were rivers of ash and debris. Civilians scavenged cautiously, searching for water, food, or family members. Japanese forces had withdrawn from open streets, hiding in rubble, executing anyone found moving. Artillery fire continued, sporadic but devastating. As soldiers tried to secure positions, smoke lingered, obscuring vision, carrying the sound of cries across blocks. Children huddled silently, their small hands pressed to ears against the distant roar. Soldiers recorded names and positions of survivors, exhausted yet driven to maintain order amidst chaos. The city's skyline was jagged, blackened, scarred, a testament to both resilience and devastation. What they didn't yet know was that survival came at a cost beyond counting. As the guns began to fade, silence descended unevenly across Manila. The streets were littered with debris, burned buildings, and the remnants of lives interrupted. Civilians emerged cautiously, eyes wide, faces streaked with ash and grief. Survivors whispered names, recounting who had fled and who had vanished. Soldiers moved through ruins, rifles at the ready, scanning for remaining threats. The river reflected broken beams and drifting bodies, a quiet mirror to the chaos that had raged. Smoke lingered, curling from hidden embers and hollowed structures. Children clutched mothers' hands, the sound of their breathing, loud in the absence of artillery. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, scarred and exhausted. When the guns ceased, the silence was heavier than the smoke. Flames still licked the skeletal rooftops of Intramuros as dawn broke over Manila Bay. Corporal Henry Thompson raised his binoculars, scanning streets where shadows of civilians moved cautiously among ruins. American flags were hoisted over shattered buildings, tattered and smoke-stained, flapping weakly in the humid breeze. Survivors emerged from basements and tunnels, faces streaked with ash and tears, blinking against the morning light. The Pasig reflected fire, debris drifting silently downstream. Tanks idled, engines cooling, their tracks leaving deep grooves in mud and rubble. Soldiers checked positions, rifles lowered but eyes wary, families reunited in cautious, tentative embraces, holding one another like fragile life rafts. The air smelled of wet ash, gunpowder, and damp stone. What they didn't yet know was that the city they had fought to reclaim was scarcely recognizable as home. Along Escolta Avenue, the streets were silent, except for the occasional groan of shifting rubble. Private Luis Mendoza stepped over fragments of furniture and shattered glass, guiding an elderly woman past the ruins of her home. The smell of burned timber lingered, mingling with the metallic tang of old blood. American engineers inspected collapsed buildings, their helmets gleaming in the weak sunlight. A group of children tentatively climbed from a collapsed church, rosaries clutched tightly to their chests. Civilians whispered names of the missing, counting faces that had disappeared amidst the month-long inferno. Tanks rumbled slowly past, careful to avoid weakened streets. Soldiers scribbled reports, noting positions cleared, bodies recovered, and structures too dangerous to enter. Smoke from hidden embers coiled in the narrow streets, twisting around broken walls. No one imagined this would become a victory marked by absence rather than triumph. The bay itself was a mirror to devastation. Waves lapped against piers, strewn with debris, charred planks, twisted metal, and occasional bodies drifting downstream. Fishermen cautiously returned, nets tangled in the remnants of boats. Corporal James Holden walked the shoreline, eyes tracing the orange reflection of smouldering ruins. American landing craft remained offshore, engines idling, ready to evacuate survivors if needed. Civilians retrieved what belongings they could, dragging scorched furniture and salvaged possessions along the water's edge. Smoke rose in intermittent columns, carrying the scent of ash and salt. Soldiers handed rations to weary families, faces pale and trembling. The once bustling Bay District was now a tableau of loss, quiet, except for the distant hum of artillery that had ceased. What they didn't yet know was that even the water seemed to mourn what had been destroyed on land. In Malate, families emerged from hidden basements for the first time in weeks. Maria Santos held her daughter's hand, stepping over cracked pavement and charred beams. Private Robert Kane guided them toward a makeshift aid station, noting collapsed walls and the remains of homes. Fires still burned in pockets, sending smoke into the humid morning air. Soldiers helped retrieve survivors, lifting the injured from rubble with careful precision. Civilians clutched whatever remained of their possessions: clothing, cooking pots, photographs singed at the edges. A priest, Father Lorenzo, knelt in the street, giving thanks for life amid ruin. Tanks and jeeps moved slowly along streets, engines humming a steady, somber note. Even birds had returned, cautiously, circling above blackened ruins. No one imagined this would become a day where survival felt heavier than victory. The cathedral in Intramuros was reduced to a skeleton of walls and arches. Corporal Luis Ortega helped survivors climb through the shattered entrance, the air thick with smoke and ash. Candles flickered weakly in niches, casting long shadows over broken pews. Civilians pressed together, trembling, whispering names, recounting memories, and praying for those lost. American engineers began cataloging structural damage, noting walls that might collapse without warning. A child, Thomas, pointed toward the collapsed belfry, eyes wide, mouth open in disbelief. Soldiers moved cautiously, carrying rations and blankets to those too weak to stand. The smell of wet stone, soot, and human grief clung to every corner. Outside, tanks rumbled through rubble-strewn streets, engines low and steady. What they didn't yet know was that the city's heart had been scarred in ways that no flag could heal. Along the northern suburbs, survivors tentatively began to rebuild. Filipino families returned to homes partially standing, salvaging furniture and belongings from the ashes. Soldiers patrolled cautiously, ensuring that pockets of Japanese resistance had been cleared. Corpses were buried in shallow graves along alleys and riverbanks, marked with wooden crosses. Smoke lingered, coiling around the few trees left standing, the scent of burned timber heavy in the air. Children ran along streets once familiar, stepping carefully over debris. Private William Harris helped a young boy retrieve a toy, its paint scorched but recognizable. Civilians whispered thanks to soldiers, their voices soft, weary. Engineers began erecting temporary shelters, a patchwork of corrugated iron and tarpaulin. No one imagined that rebuilding would begin amid the echoes of such loss. The main plaza was littered with remnants of life and war. Banners of both nations hung limply from charred poles. Soldiers inspected ruins, noting artillery damage and collapsed walls. Civilians gathered in small groups, recounting tales of escape and survival, faces pale and eyes haunted. Tanks rested idle, treads sunk in mud and rubble, engines quiet. Smoke still rose from scattered fires, the orange glow reflecting against wet stones. A nurse, Carmen Rivera, treated the last of the wounded, hands steady but stained with soot. Children clutched dolls or small possessions, eyes wide with fear and wonder. Father Gabriel led a final prayer in the open plaza, voice rising against the quiet hum of destruction. What they didn't yet know was that peace would feel as fragile as the city they had reclaimed. As the sun set over Manila Bay, the city exhaled a weary sigh. The skyline was jagged, skeletal, a silhouette of fire-streaked ruins against the orange sky. Survivors emerged from tunnels, basements, and shelters, blinking against the smoke and heat. Soldiers lowered their rifles, tired but vigilant, scanning for hidden threats, one last time. Civilians gathered in small clusters, embracing and weeping, faces reflecting both relief and grief. The water mirrored the destruction, orange and black in the fading light. Smoke curled from hidden embers, lingering like a memory in the humid air. Tanks and jeeps idled, engines low, a quiet testament to the cost of victory. They had won a city that no longer existed. Smoke still drifted lazily from university halls as dawn touched the blackened rooftops. Professor Ramon Delgado sifted through the remnants of burned manuscripts, their charred edges crumbling beneath his fingers. Typewriters sat silent in abandoned offices, keys stiff with soot and neglect. Church steeples pierced the morning haze, towers reduced to fractured skeletons that leaned precariously against the sky. Civilians moved cautiously through the streets, stepping over bricks and fallen beams, their eyes tracing what had been lost. Soldiers patrolled quietly, rifles slung low, eyes scanning for remnants of danger. Ash coated every surface, clinging to hair, clothing, and skin. Water trickled through cracked roads, carrying smoke and debris downstream. In the plaza, the remnants of fountains bubbled weakly, surrounded by rubble and scorched statues. What they didn't yet know was that the damage was not only physical, but woven into the memory of every survivor. The cathedral doors hung crooked on scorched hinges. Father Lorenzo moved among pews splintered by shellfire, hands trembling as he touched the altar, now blackened with smoke. Candles burned weakly in niches where stained glass had once told stories of saints and angels. Civilians knelt silently, whispering names of the dead, their breaths mingling with ash and the lingering scent of cordite. Rubble from the belfry littered the floor, each stone a testament to the artillery that had reshaped history. Soldiers carried rations to those who lingered, faces pale beneath soot-streaked helmets. Children traced the outlines of windows now empty of glass, their small fingers brushing against centuries of carved stone. Smoke hung in the air, thick and persistent, obscuring sunlight and hope alike. Street vendors cautiously returned, carrying what little food survived the conflagration. No one imagined this would become a city of memory before it could be a city of recovery. In Ermita, the ruins of theaters and offices spoke of lives interrupted. Private William Harris stepped through a collapsed lobby, the smell of scorched paper and plaster heavy in his nose. Typewriters sat in puddles, keys frozen mid-sentence, documents smouldering beneath. Civilians retrieved mementos, a book, a photograph, a small statue, small fragments of normalcy amidst chaos. Japanese defenders had long since withdrawn, leaving only echoes of fear behind. Tanks remained idle in the streets, treads sunk into mud and debris. Fires still glowed in pockets of rubble, smoke coiling upward like ghosts of the past. Children wandered with cautious curiosity, picking over ruins with eyes wide and silent. Soldiers took note of architectural damage, marking structures that might collapse without warning. What they didn't yet know was that the city's cultural soul had been burned as deeply as its streets. Along the Pasig, bridges lay in fractured silence. Civilians crossed cautiously, balancing on beams or wading through shallow currents littered with debris. Boats that had once carried goods and people now floated charred and broken. Professor Delgado guided a small group to a surviving library wing, where charred books still clung to shelves, their words almost illegible. American engineers moved slowly, cataloguing ruins, noting which walls had survived the shelling. Smoke drifted in long columns, the orange haze reflected in the water. Mothers held children close, stepping carefully over stones slick with ash. Tanks rumbled softly in distant streets, engines low, a reminder of battles past. Birds cautiously returned, perching on broken rooftops and leaning beams. No one imagined that what remained would be both a city and a memorial of loss. The plaza, once filled with life, was now a quiet monument of destruction. Rubble coated fountains and statues, the water stagnant and grey. Civilians gathered what they could, stacking bricks, salvaging timber, trying to reconstruct semblances of home. Soldiers moved quietly, patrolling streets that no longer held commerce, only memory. Typewriters lay abandoned in half-collapsed offices, silent witnesses to interrupted work and letters never sent. Children traced the outlines of markets, now reduced to charred timbers, holding small dolls or trinkets. The smell of wet ash lingered, heavy and suffocating, pressing on every breath. Smoke from hidden embers coiled upward, caught in the wind like ribbons of grief. Civilians whispered to one another, recounting where family members had been, who had survived, who had vanished. What they didn't yet know was that even the act of walking these streets carried the weight of memory. In Malate, homes were gutted and streets cracked. Private Luis Mendoza assisted a family carrying a salvaged chest of documents, careful not to disturb the debris underfoot. Furniture lay twisted and scorched, clothing hung from bent nails, ash clinging to fabric. Engineers marked structures that might collapse without warning, the sound of their hammers echoing in hollow spaces. Mothers guided children past rubble, each step cautious, each glance wary. Smoke and dust clung to hair and skin, the orange haze of fire, now replaced by grey and silence. Soldiers noted the survival of certain walls, memorials to the resilience of materials and craft. A priest offered blessings quietly, voice soft against the ambient hum of recovery. Civilians paused to examine doorways and niches, tracing where history had ended and the future would begin. No one imagined how fragile survival could feel amid layers of devastation. Universities and offices became tombs of knowledge. Professor Delgado ran fingers over charred manuscripts, inhaling the smell of burned paper and ink. Lecture halls were silent, blackened benches empty, chalkboards scorched with indistinct writing. Students' notes had been lost, books reduced to ash, typewriters immobile. American engineers catalogued damage, noting what could be salvaged and what must be abandoned. Children wandered corridors with quiet curiosity, picking small fragments to take home, traces of life surviving fire. Tanks rumbled in distant streets, engines low, careful to avoid weakened roads. Civilians paused before ruined monuments, tracing the outlines with hands, Remembering what once was, smoke drifted lazily from hidden embers, lingering like a memory of catastrophe. What they didn't yet know was that knowledge itself had been scarred as deeply as the city. As twilight settled, Manila exhaled a weary silence. The streets were littered with ash and broken masonry. Rooftops sagged under the weight of fire and neglect. Civilians gathered in small clusters, speaking softly, mourning loudly, whispering names that would not be forgotten. Soldiers patrolled cautiously, rifles low, eyes scanning for dangers, now mostly past. Smoke lingered in long coils above the ruins, the air heavy with the scent of charred timber and wet stone. The sun cast long shadows over skeletal structures, highlighting the loss of centuries in a single month. Children clutched the few salvaged possessions they could carry, holding on to fragments of a vanished world. Engineers worked quietly, preparing to rebuild in measured steps. The city's soul smouldered beneath layers of dust and silence. The courtrooms smelled of ink and polished wood, a quiet tension hanging in the air. Documents stamped with seals of judgment were spread across long oak tables, edges crisp, bearing the weight of months of investigation. Prosecutor Margaret Hensley flipped through photographs of ruined buildings, civilians and soldiers, each image a frozen testament to choices made in fire. Witnesses whispered their recollections into microphones, voices trembling, recounting horror in measured, careful tones. Japanese officers sat stiffly, uniforms pristine, despite the chaos outside these walls. Outside, Manila's streets still bore the scars of artillery and flame, smoke curling faintly from hidden embers. Historians noted each testimony, recording names, dates, and locations, aware that memory itself had become evidence. Soldiers from the 1st Cavalry Division observed quietly, faces etched with fatigue and reflection. The atmosphere was heavy with irony, justice administered in rooms far removed from the streets where it was most needed. What they didn't yet know was how delayed justice could ripple across generations. In a separate chamber, photographs were laid out on tables, each capturing a fragment of horror. Civilians huddled in alleys, their eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams. Burned homes and rubble-strewn streets froze moments of despair for future scrutiny. Sergeant Luis Ortega traced his finger over an image of Intramuros, now skeletal, remembering every shelling and every collapsed roof. Military investigators noted positions of Japanese troops and fortifications, cataloguing crimes with clinical precision. The air was thick with dust, paper, and the scent of ink, a stark contrast to the stench of fire that had once filled the city. Survivors recounted moments of terror, tears falling silently onto tables of evidence. Photographs of Iwabuchi surfaced, stern-faced and rigid, a man both feared and hunted. Legal clerks stamped files methodically, a slow percussion echoing in the otherwise silent room. No one imagined this would become a record not just of acts, but of moral weight. The sea swallowed Iwabuchi Esther's final moments. On a jagged cliff near Cavite, he looked down at the water, silent, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of regret. Soldiers nearby noted the waves lapping at rocks, oblivious to history being written above them. His uniform, immaculate even in despair, caught the low sun as he stepped into the surf. Witnesses would later describe the tide carrying him away, a man removed from the stage of judgment he had evaded. Photographers documented the shoreline, capturing waves, sand, and foam as proof of a final act. Commanders reflected quietly on the irony of fate. One man responsible for thousands of deaths, meeting his end in solitary water. Historians would later debate whether his death brought closure or merely added to the city's complex legacy. The sea, indifferent and vast, swallowed both man and memory alike. What they didn't yet know was how absence could speak as loudly as testimony. Back in Manila, judges convened to assign responsibility. Chambers smelled of polished wood and legal ink, punctuated by the soft shuffle of papers. Documents bearing witness statements, military reports and photographs were catalogued meticulously, forming a narrative of human choice and consequence. Colonel James Harrison, observing proceedings, noted the interplay between command decisions and civilian suffering. Prosecutor Hensley outlined charges of murder, arson, and forced evacuation, each point grounded in evidence collected months earlier. Maps displayed artillery positions and fortified buildings, showing cause and effect in precise detail. Outside, survivors navigated streets still scarred, unsure if justice could rebuild lives. Witnesses gave depositions of the Bay District, Ermita, and Intramuros, voices quivering yet resolute. Soldiers quietly carried supplies into the ruins, aware that physical reconstruction would outlast legal proceedings. No one imagined this would become a city judged in absentia, its rubble a silent witness. Photographs of civilian survivors lined the walls of a tribunal room. Children clutched toys, mothers held infants, all captured in moments frozen by lens and light. Corporal Luis Mendoza traced these faces, recalling the streets he had patrolled weeks before. Prosecutors and historians debated the authenticity of evidence, careful to weigh fact against memory, smoke against clarity. Japanese officers, now confined, maintained stoic silence, their expressions betraying little yet revealing everything. The air felt thick, as if every breath carried the weight of lives ended prematurely. Engineers and soldiers had reconstructed fragments of streets and buildings, yet nothing could restore memory or lost laughter. Witnesses recounted events, pausing to gather courage as photographs of destruction were displayed. Court stenographers tapped rapidly, recording words that would become historical record. What they didn't yet know was that these images would speak across generations, long after the men and women in the room were gone. Outside, Manila began tentative reconstruction, rubble cleared in slow progress. Civilians salvaged what they could, carting bricks and timbers, each stone a reminder of destruction. Soldiers assisted, providing security and guidance through streets still dangerous with hidden debris. Historians moved among the ruins, photographing, measuring, noting patterns of devastation. Smoke still curled from pockets of embers, each spiral a lingering witness to violence. Engineers marked surviving structures, noting damage to foundations, masonry, and infrastructure. Mothers guided children along narrow lanes, pointing out landmarks and familiar spaces, trying to anchor memory to place. Photographers documented every effort, creating visual evidence for future studies. Legal teams prepared documents, evidence files stacked high, ready for judgment to be rendered. No one imagined this would become a city of both legal scrutiny and human restoration. Judges convened to announce verdicts, echoing through quiet chambers. Military and civilian leaders awaited the declarations, tense with anticipation and reflection. Charges for arson, murder, and atrocity were detailed, citing each photograph, report, and witness testimony. Colonel Harrison reflected on Iwabuchi's choices, wondering if survival had absolved or condemned him. Civilian observers noted the irony: justice delivered far from streets of terror, yet essential for memory and historical record. Photographs of ruins, survivors, and perpetrators lined the courtroom walls, silent witnesses to judgment. Prosecutors emphasized moral responsibility as much as legal accountability. Soldiers looked on quietly, their eyes heavy with memory of the streets they had walked, the lives they had protected. Engineers, historians, and clerks recorded the proceedings meticulously, the weight of history settling across all present. What they didn't yet know was how judgment would echo across time, beyond walls, beyond ashes. As the tribunal adjourned, the sun set over Manila Bay, soft and indifferent. The sea whispered against the pier, reflecting fire-streaked clouds of memory and loss. Survivors returned to streets slowly being cleared, carrying the quiet weight of judgment and grief. Soldiers walked alongside them, boots muffled against ash, eyes scanning for remnants of danger and hope. Documents were sealed, photographs archived, and testimonies catalogued. A structured attempt to order chaos. Engineers continued marking structures, planning restoration, while smoke lingered over blackened rooftops. Historians whispered notes, aware that the record would guide generations. Iwabuchi's absence remained a silent punctuation, the sea swallowing history and consequence alike. Justice came too late for the dead, yet it spoke for the living. Hammering echoed through the morning air, as families rebuilt walls with salvaged wood and corrugated metal. Carmen Rivera balanced a plank across two beams, while her children carried nails in a battered tin. Smoke still curled faintly from hidden embers in nearby streets, mixing with the scent of sawdust and wet mud. A tram rattled through the ruins, its brakes squealing as it slowed, the first glimpse of pre-war routine returning. Corporal Luis Mendoza watched from a distance, surveying streets he had once patrolled, now littered with tiny sparks of life. Dust rose as workers swept rubble, scattering ash into golden sunlight. Women carried buckets of water from nearby wells, careful to avoid broken glass and twisted metal. Soldiers helped lift beams, steadying structures for families who had lost everything. A cat darted between walls, cautiously reclaiming the shadows of a city. What they didn't yet know was that survival would demand not only courage, but patience. Children traced lines in the dust, their small hands sketching homes that might one day stand again. Maria Santos knelt beside Thomas, guiding his fingers over the rough pavement, telling stories of streets as they once were. Shadows of collapsed rooftops fell across chalk lines, shapes of memory drawn where hope could grow. Mothers whispered prayers for health and provision as they watched, eyes wary of every creaking wall. Engineers marked unstable buildings with red chalk, warning of potential collapse. Tanks idled along streets, stripped of weapons, now serving as temporary barricades or makeshift storage. The Pasig reflected orange sunlight, still scarred by debris from months past. Vendors cautiously set up stalls, offering fruits, rice, and bread, the first signs of commerce since liberation. Children laughed softly, voices tentative, filling streets that had only recently been silent. No one imagined this would become a city defined as much by memory as by bricks. Along Escolta Avenue, trams rattled over tracks warped by shellfire. Passengers climbed aboard carefully, balancing against motion while surveying skeletal storefronts. Streetcars had returned slowly, engines coughing against the morning heat, carrying both goods and stories of survival. Private William Harris helped an elderly man step down, the man clutching a satchel of salvaged papers. Vendors called out, selling produce from baskets atop rubble-strewn sidewalks. Children followed, curiosity drawing them near, watching small engines move like stubborn creatures through the ruins. Soldiers stood in small groups, rifles now ceremonial, eyes scanning rubble-strewn corners. Smoke from distant embers drifted lazily across streets, a faint reminder of what had passed. Women carried water from cisterns, balancing vessels on their heads while singing softly. What they didn't yet know was that the rhythm of survival would shape a new city from the skeletons of the old. In the Bay District, fishermen returned cautiously to their boats. Ropes frayed and hulls blackened, but the first nets of post-war Manila were cast in early morning light. Luis Ortega observed from the shore, noting how the community reclaimed routines disrupted for months. Children clambered onto docks, laughing as waves splashed their bare feet. Smoke from embers mixed with salt water, scenting the air with both devastation and renewal. Mothers called across alleys, bringing children home before the sun climbed too high. Soldiers helped clear debris, shifting wood and stone to create narrow, passable streets. Photographers documented families restoring homes, capturing hope amid ruin. Engineers marked streets for repair, planning drainage and foundations, while locals salvaged materials. No one imagined this would become a symphony of small victories against the shadow of war. In Intramuros, ruins became gardens and gathering spaces. A group of women swept ash from courtyard floors, planting seeds in small patches of soil amid fallen stones. Father Lorenzo blessed each sprouting plant, murmuring prayers for growth and renewal. Children played cautiously around collapsed arches, their laughter a fragile, bright contrast to charred stone. Soldiers moved supplies for reconstruction, carrying beams and salvaged furniture through narrow alleyways. Smoke still lingered from hidden embers, the orange haze now a soft, diffuse light at dusk. Families retrieved personal belongings from rubble, careful to preserve photographs and letters. Market stalls appeared along cleared streets, small fires cooking rice and fish. Engineers inspected remaining walls, noting stability while civilians offered guidance from memory. What they didn't yet know was that even charred stones could teach lessons of resilience. Along the Pasig River, boats transported salvaged materials. Children balanced on timbers, helping carry supplies to partially rebuilt homes. Mothers coordinated crews, shouting instructions across water, each call precise and practiced. Soldiers watched, rifles slung, offering silent protection against lingering dangers. The water reflected a soft orange glow from the sun, rippling gently against hulls and debris. Survivors paused to admire what they had reconstructed, walls rising from rubble like tentative statements of life. The air was heavy with the scent of wet wood, ash, and the river itself. Engineers measured every plank and beam, ensuring structural integrity amid improvisation. Old friends reunited, sharing news of loved ones, mending the social fabric as carefully as they did the streets. No one imagined that a river could carry both debris and hope side by side. Market streets filled slowly with chatter and movement. Vendors set up makeshift stalls, crates of rice and vegetables precariously balanced atop rubble. Children ran between legs, carrying bundles of wood or small trinkets, their faces smudged with soot. Soldiers patrolled lightly, ensuring safety rather than enforcing order, eyes reflecting relief and fatigue. Dust rose in the morning sun as carts moved slowly over cobbled stones broken by artillery. Women shared food, laughter punctuating the haze of smoke and labor. Engineers marked streets for repair, coordinating with families clearing debris. Elderly men reminisced about pre-war markets, narrating memories of commerce and festivals. The tram's bell echoed faintly, announcing a return of rhythm and routine to once silent avenues. What they didn't yet know was that these streets would hold both memory and future life in delicate balance. As evening fell over Manila, a calm settled among ruins. Families sat outside rebuilt homes, children leaning against salvaged walls, faces streaked with soot and hope. The first tram returned to the depot, its engine a gentle, persistent hum, threading through broken streets. Smoke from small fires for cooking drifted into the sky, mingling with the fading sun. Soldiers walked among civilians, observing, assisting, but increasingly stepping back to allow the city's own rhythm to reassert itself. Dust settled, and with it the weight of recent months seemed lighter, if only slightly. Children chased shadows across streets, their laughter filling the fragile quiet. Families shared stories, piecing together the city from memory, hope, and courage. From the rubble, life began to whisper once more. A bottle floated slowly in the Pasig River, bobbing against the current, its corked neck holding a fragile piece of paper. Carmen Rivera reached down, hands trembling as she lifted the glass, aware that the fragile cylinder might contain voices long silenced. She uncorked it, letting the damp air meet the ink-stained paper inside. The words, slanted and hurried, spoke of a mother hiding her children in a basement, counting days by whispered prayers. Outside, the river lapped against broken piers, reflecting orange light from fires still smoldering across the city. Children watched, curious and cautious, sensing the solemnity of discovery. Soldiers moved nearby, rifles slung low, eyes scanning for danger, while respecting the intimacy of the moment. Dust hung in the air, particles floating like tiny witnesses to history. The bottle rested in Carmen's hands, fragile as memory itself. What they didn't yet know was that such letters would become lifelines across time. In a partially collapsed schoolroom, crumpled notebook pages were recovered from beneath splintered desks. Luis Ortega unfolded them carefully, soot clinging to his fingertips, revealing neat handwriting interrupted by jagged tears. A child's diary recounted hidden meals, whispered hopes, and the fear of artillery shaking walls. Soldiers paused to read over shoulders, faces reflecting empathy and sorrow. Outside, trams rattled over warped tracks, carrying the first tentative signs of routine back into the city. Civilians gathered fragments of their past, piecing together what had been lost. The paper smelled faintly of smoke and damp, a physical reminder of the Inferno months earlier. Photographers captured pages, careful not to disturb the fragile ink. Engineers passed quietly, surveying damage while acknowledging the human weight captured in scribbles and drawings. No one imagined this would become a city of surviving voices amid ashes. Fragments of letters were pinned to makeshift boards in the plaza. Father Lorenzo read aloud softly, his voice echoing against skeletal walls and empty windows. Words described loved ones gone, meals stolen, and prayers offered in secret. Civilians paused, listening as the letters brought back names and faces, each a flicker of memory. Soldiers stood respectfully nearby, observing the human side of destruction they had witnessed firsthand. Children traced the letters with fingers, attempting to understand stories that transcended age. Smoke drifted faintly from distant kitchens, mingling with the scent of paper and ash. Photographers captured the moments, documenting the resilience and vulnerability of survivors. Engineers cleared debris around the plaza, careful not to disturb the letters pinned to weathered wood. What they didn't yet know was how these words would shape remembrance more powerfully than monuments ever could. In the ruins of a hospital, testimony was preserved in faint ink on scraps of paper. Nurses who had survived whispered names of patients lost to fire and artillery, their voices carrying through charred hallways. Photographs laid on makeshift tables showed children and families, eyes wide with fear yet unbowed. Soldiers handled each item carefully, aware that paper could bear witness in ways that photographs alone could not. Smoke from hidden embers drifted past the windows, catching the low sunlight in amber streaks. Civilians lingered, reading fragments aloud, connecting names to streets and neighborhoods they remembered. Engineers moved cautiously, noting structural hazards as they documented artifacts of life before destruction. Children peeked through collapsed doors, listening intently, absorbing history in tactile and auditory forms. No one imagined this would become a library of human resilience, preserved in soot and silence. A small family gathered around a surviving radio, listening to faint static between broadcasts. Voices read fragments of letters from the war. "We hide beneath the floorboards," wrote one child, "but I hope the sun will return soon." Luis Ortega adjusted the dial, careful not to lose the faint signal, carrying distant recollections. Mothers held children close, eyes tracing the ceiling for patterns of damage and memory alike. Soldiers observed quietly, feeling the weight of histories they could neither undo nor fully comprehend. Smoke from distant fires mingled with the scent of cooked rice, grounding grief in everyday smells. Photographers documented the scene, the interplay between human presence and memory tangible in each frame. The city, battered and scarred, listened along with them, absorbing voices that refused to die. What they didn't yet know was that these small transmissions carried echoes that would outlast walls and rubble. In Intramuros, fragments of diaries were discovered beneath fallen arches. Father Lorenzo held them gently, reading passages of prayer and fear aloud to civilians passing through the skeletal courtyards. Children traced letters with careful fingers, whispering names aloud as if summoning the dead. Soldiers crouched nearby, rifles slung, respecting the reverence of private recollections. Dust swirled in beams of light, illuminating ink smudged by smoke and water. Photographers captured pages and faces, preserving fragile moments of human expression. Engineers noted structural hazards, moving cautiously so as not to disturb the tangible traces of survival. Mothers adjusted blankets over small children, keeping them warm while they listened. The letters spoke of ordinary lives pressed into extraordinary circumstances. No one imagined these remnants of paper would carry the weight of history's conscience. Outside, a makeshift memorial displayed letters and sketches pinned to boards. Carmen Rivera read aloud fragments, a young boy's sketch of a street now gone, a mother's plea for mercy, a teacher's diary describing hidden classrooms. Soldiers and civilians alike paused, feeling the intimate connection of lives erased yet preserved in ink. Smoke drifted from nearby fires, orange light casting long shadows on the display. Children quietly added drawings of their own, tracing streets reborn and structures rebuilt. Photographers recorded the interaction, capturing human emotion, intertwined with documentation. Engineers monitored the surroundings, ensuring safety while respecting the sacred display. Civilians shared stories, connecting letters to actual streets, homes, and bridges. What they didn't yet know was how these traces of pen and paper would become anchors for memory and culture. As evening fell, Manila absorbed a quiet stillness. The river reflected the last orange streaks of sun, shimmering around the bottle that had started the day's discovery. Fragments of diaries and letters were gathered gently into bundles, ready to be preserved in archives. Civilians lingered, whispering names aloud, imagining the hands that had written, the breath that had carried words across fire and ruin. Soldiers observed respectfully, aware that their rifles could not safeguard memory, only witness it. Smoke hung faintly in the air, mingling with the scent of ink and dust. Children traced letters with fingers, eyes wide with understanding beyond their years. Photographers captured the final rays on paper and hands, preserving light and shadow for generations. Their words outlived their breath, a faint light in the long night of history. Morning light fell over the skeletal streets of Manila, illuminating twisted metal and fractured stone. A tram rattled past, its solitary bell clanging against empty avenues, echoing in a silence once filled with life. Archival footage flickered alongside the present, Escolta Avenue bustling with cars, vendors calling out, and pedestrians weaving beneath ornate streetlights. Luis Ortega paused, noting the stark contrast between past and present, the weight of absence pressing in. Cathedral bells that once marked hours were replaced by silence, broken only by distant crows. Soldiers and civilians moved carefully through rubble, scanning for remnants of memory amid ruin. The sun glinted off jagged glass, fragments of windows that once framed everyday life. Dust rose gently from cracked pavement as wind carried it down alleys. Photographers adjusted lenses, capturing shadows alongside archival light. What they didn't yet know was that every stone, every fissure, would carry stories the city refused to forget. Intramuros, once a fortress of colonial memory, now crouched beneath the weight of destruction. Collapsed walls revealed interiors of classrooms, offices, and chapels, each echoing absent footsteps. Father Lorenzo traced fingers along remaining masonry, remembering sermons delivered in the grand cathedral before fire consumed it. Archival footage showed priests in flowing robes leading congregations, children kneeling on polished floors. Dust swirled in shafts of sunlight, mingling with soot and memory. Soldiers guided civilians through narrow pathways, noting structural hazards while observing faint traces of life past. Windows, once adorned with stained glass, now gaped empty, framing sky instead of scripture. Photographers captured both angles, juxtaposing what had been with what remained. Mothers led children cautiously through doorways, whispering names of streets long gone. No one imagined this would become a city defined as much by absence as by architecture. Along the Pasig River, reflections shimmered across murky water. Boats moved slowly, carrying salvaged materials, the sound of oars cutting through silence. Archival footage showed ferries brimming with passengers, commerce thriving along both banks. Carmen Rivera watched, remembering the laughter and music that had once drifted across the water. Smoke rose faintly from distant embers, blending with morning haze. Children pointed to ruins, drawing invisible lines in the air where buildings had once stood. Engineers measured foundations, planning reconstruction, while noting historic damage patterns. Soldiers observed, rifles now resting, as life cautiously reclaimed the river's edge. The sun glinted off bent metal and broken docks, a quiet witness to resilience. What they didn't yet know was how memory would flow along these waterways, carrying both loss and hope. Skyline shots revealed empty rooftops, chimneys like blackened teeth against the dawn. Pre-war Manila had risen in elegance, Art Deco facades, gleaming hotels and offices with polished stone. Now skeletal frames and gaping walls replaced ornamentation, and the wind whistled through voids where life once thrived. Photographers captured both frames, dissolving one into the other. The vibrancy of the 1930s, dissolving into 1945's aftermath. Children played cautiously among debris, their laughter fragile, in contrast to the grandeur once overhead. Engineers marked damaged streets and surviving structures, cataloguing what might be restored. Mothers guided toddlers through narrow alleys, pointing toward landmarks visible in both film and present reality. Soldiers moved with measured caution, eyes scanning for hidden hazards. The city's heartbeat, once steady, now pulsed in fragments. No one imagined this would become a testament to both devastation and enduring spirit. Street vendors returned, tentative, arranging goods on overturned crates. Archival images of bustling commerce, hats and dresses bright under sun, overlaid the scene. Carmen Rivera sold bread carefully balanced on salvaged wood, eyes tracing remnants of windows that had once showcased fine merchandise. Children clutched small coins, counting carefully, laughing in whispers. Smoke from cooking fires mingled with lingering dust, scenting air with survival. Soldiers paused, watching the small rituals of daily life return, the city's rhythm gradually asserting itself. Engineers measured tram tracks, warped by shell fire, planning repairs while remembering past precision. Photographers captured hands, exchanging coins, eyes meeting across distance, human stories bridging past and present. The city exhaled faintly, life threading through ruins. What they didn't yet know was how everyday life would stitch memory into future identity. The cathedral square stood empty, its bells silent, walls charred, yet still commanding presence. Archival footage showed masses and festivals, priests leading prayers, citizens gathering in reverent celebration. Now, Mother Teresa's statue stood amid rubble, hands folded, eyes gazing upon streets once vibrant. Luis Ortega and engineers walked carefully across cracked cobblestones, observing the skeletal framework of lost towers. Dust rose with each footfall, soft golden light illuminating soot-stained arches. Civilians knelt quietly, placing flowers upon foundations, connecting grief with remembrance. Soldiers and children watched silently, bridging generations of experience and survival. Photographers documented the interplay of shadow, ruin, and memory, capturing an intangible connection. The air smelled faintly of ash, wet earth, and hope. No one imagined this would become a square of reflection, more than recreation. Along the harbour, cargo ships moved slowly, bringing supplies to a city, learning to breathe again. Archival footage showed ships brimming with goods, docks crowded with workers and families. Now cranes lifted salvaged timber and stone, rebuilding what fire and artillery had scattered. Carmen Rivera guided children along the pier, pointing to boats that once ferried joy and commerce. Soldiers assisted, moving materials with steady precision, aware that the weight of reconstruction mirrored the weight of memory. Smoke from nearby kitchens mingled with sea salt, scenting the air with resilience. Photographers documented lines of laborers and vessels, juxtaposing past energy against present care. Engineers noted tidal patterns and dock damage, planning repairs that bridged errors. Children leaned against beams, tracing outlines of past streets and imagined futures. What they didn't yet know was how the harbour itself would carry the pulse of a reborn city. As evening descended, Manila's silhouette stood against a dying sun, jagged yet unbowed. Rooftops and walls cast long shadows across silent streets, a city both remembered and present. Archival footage of lights twinkling, music drifting, merged with current shadows. The contrast almost cinematic. Carmen Rivera paused on a bridge, tracing the skyline, eyes moist with reflection. Soldiers lingered, boots heavy with history, observing life threading cautiously through ruins. Children played among remnants of walls, laughter soft yet resilient. Engineers and historians recorded measurements and impressions, cataloguing destruction and endurance. The wind carried faint echoes of cathedral bells, lost yet imagined. The city exhaled slowly, memory and resilience intertwined. Time took the city, but could not take its name. MacArthur's boots crunched over the debris-strewn streets of Manila, each step echoing in the hollow air of what had once been Escolta Avenue. Dust hung thick, mingling with the faint scent of smoke and salt from the nearby Pasig River. Soldiers flanked him, helmets scuffed, rifles resting against shoulders, eyes scanning the skeletal buildings for hidden danger. MacArthur paused before a collapsed archway, torchlight flickering across his face, shadow and light revealing a calm, unreadable expression. Behind him, a line of tanks remained silent, engines idling, their metal surfaces reflecting the orange glow of distant fires. Civilians peeked cautiously from behind walls, some daring a small wave, others clutching children close. Archival footage of the same street before the war, trams gliding, merchants shouting, children racing, dissolved into present ruin. Luis Ortega, documenting the scene, noted the stark contrast: a commander returning, a city waiting. What they didn't yet know was that this liberation would come with scars deeper than the rubble beneath their feet. The general approached the central plaza, where remnants of a fountain jutted from cracked stone. Flags fluttered from broken flagpoles, half tattered, half welcoming, the stars and stripes now mingling with Manila's ghosts. Soldiers saluted as MacArthur passed, boots in rhythm against shattered cobblestones. Each step was measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of promises made in distant lighty waters. The silence was punctuated by the soft whistle of wind through skeletal windows and the occasional cry of a child reclaiming streets. Archival photographs displayed ceremonies of pre-war Manila, parades, civic celebrations, and juxtaposed them with soldiers stepping cautiously over debris. Civilians observed quietly, some whispering names of lost family members, others silently hoping the general's presence signaled the end of horror. Engineers surveyed damage, noting structural integrity, while avoiding the human theatre unfolding. No one imagined this would become a city where victory walked cautiously, like a shadow among ruins. MacArthur stopped near the cathedral steps, eyes tracing the crumbling bell tower that once rang daily. Torchlight highlighted intricate carvings now blackened and cracked, the faint scent of burnt wood still lingering. Soldiers adjusted gear, checking ammunition and radios, aware that while the battle had ended, the memory of destruction was ongoing. Civilians knelt at the base, leaving flowers and small tokens, bridging reverence with grief. Luis Ortega captured the juxtaposition, a leader's silhouette against a monument to what had been lost. Smoke drifted gently from collapsed rooftops, carried by a light breeze that also bore whispers of prayers and prayers unspoken. Footsteps echoed, uneven and careful, as if the city itself were measuring his presence. The general's eyes moved slowly across each ruin, registering strategy, loss, and the human cost simultaneously. What they didn't yet know was how a hero's return would be inseparable from the weight of tragedy. In the shadow of a collapsed office block, MacArthur observed soldiers coordinating relief efforts. Rations were distributed, field medics tending to the sick and wounded, civilians assisting in clearing debris. Archival footage of similar logistical operations in Leyte and Corregidor flashed in overlay, reminding viewers of years spent reclaiming the Philippines. Children watched curiously, unsure if this presence was reassurance or authority. A mother, Maria Santos, whispered to her son about the promises fulfilled, though tempered by the ruins surrounding them. Luis Ortega documented every interaction, salutes exchanged, hands reaching out, small gestures amid grand destruction. The general's expression remained composed, torchlight highlighting faint lines etched by decades of command. Engineers monitored structural hazards as relief operations unfolded, aware that the general's presence added both hope and pressure. No one imagined this would become a city where every act of rebuilding was watched under the weight of expectation. As the sun dipped low, Shadows stretched across broken plazas and streets. MacArthur's silhouette merged with the skeletal outlines of buildings, a figure both commanding and solitary. Soldiers paused to rest, gazing at the city he had promised to reclaim. Dust swirled through light shafts, landing on polished boots and tattered uniforms alike. Archival images of pre-war festivals overlaid on present silence, the vibrancy of Manila only faintly perceptible beneath layers of smoke and rubble. Civilians lingered, some recording oral accounts, others silently cataloguing personal memories. Engineers measured structural remnants, planning reconstruction with precision, while acknowledging the intangible weight of leadership. Photographers framed each tableau, torchlight glinting off debris, soldiers, and the general. Children sketched silently in the dust, capturing visions of both hope and ruin. What they didn't yet know was that the shadow of command would stretch as far as the city's scars. MacArthur paused before a destroyed school, where blackened walls still bore traces of chalked lessons. Luis Ortega knelt to photograph a faded inscription, "Learn, survive, remember." Soldiers nearby assisted civilians in retrieving salvaged books, careful to preserve fragments of knowledge. Archival images showed the same classrooms vibrant with life, children laughing, teachers instructing, sunlight flooding through intact windows. The contrast was stark. Education halted, futures interrupted. Civilians spoke in hushed tones, sharing memories of lessons interrupted by artillery fire. Engineers catalogued structural damage, while coordinating with military authorities on potential reconstruction. MacArthur's gaze swept across the street, noticing the human cost interwoven with strategic victory. Children tentatively returned, curious, peering through broken doors to reclaim fragments of their education. No one imagined this would become a city where leadership walked alongside the quiet testimony of loss. Night fell, torchlight casting long wavering shadows over shattered streets. MacArthur's staff moved quietly, coordinating reports and communicating with distant command posts. Soldiers stood in small clusters, talking softly about families, survival, and the city now in their care. Civilians lit small fires to cook, smoke mingling with torchlight, casting flickering shapes on debris. Photographers captured reflections on puddles, highlighting both the devastation and the meticulous order imposed by military presence. Luis Ortega recorded the quiet tension, a leader's return, framed against ongoing human recovery. Engineers worked into dusk, measuring and marking hazards under dim light, careful not to disturb delicate fragments of the past. Children peered curiously at the general, unsure if he represented hope or the memory of war. Maria Santos whispered to her son, pointing toward him, "Even heroes walk through ashes." What they didn't yet know was that his shadow would linger longer than the rubble itself. MacArthur ascended a gentle rise overlooking the harbour, torchlight glinting off calm waters streaked with orange reflections. Ships offloaded supplies slowly, waves lapping against debris-littered docks, a quiet rhythm of survival resuming. Soldiers saluted as he gazed over the city he had reclaimed, their shadows stretching across debris like silent witnesses. Civilians observed, cautious yet attentive, cataloguing history as it unfolded before them. Archival footage showed the harbour before destruction, bustling with trade and movement, contrasting with its present, fractured serenity. The wind carried faint echoes of bells, children's laughter, and distant artillery now silenced. Engineers and photographers documented the moment, aware of its weight in both strategy and memory. The general lowered his torch, eyes tracing familiar streets now scarred yet alive. In victory, even heroes walk through ashes. Bulldozers rumbled over streets once lined with Art Deco facades, their engines vibrating through the hollow shells of buildings. Dust rose in lazy clouds, mingling with the scent of crushed stone and sun-warmed metal. Workers guided machinery past remnants of ancient walls, careful to avoid collapsing foundations of churches and schools. Photographers captured the juxtaposition, modern machines against the fragile skeleton of a city still whispering history. Luis Ortega traced his fingers along a fragment of mosaic, noting faded patterns that survived beneath the rubble. Old maps lay on a nearby table, ink smudged and edges frayed, showing streets now replaced by new avenues. City planners discussed grid lines and zoning, unaware of the human lives once threading through these streets. Mothers and children passed cautiously, glancing at the unfamiliar modernity, swallowing familiar corners. Sunlight caught the reflection of glass in rising frames, echoing pre-war elegance now lost. What they didn't yet know was how quickly memory could be masked by steel and concrete. In a museum tucked between rebuilt blocks, fading photographs hung behind glass, curling at the edges. Images of Intramuros before the war, street markets, cathedral bells, students walking to school, looked fragile under dim lighting. Visitors leaned close, whispering names of ancestors and places, connecting personal memory with historical traces. Historian Carmen Rivera held a notebook, marking locations of lost buildings, streets and houses, cross-referencing archival photographs. The contrast was jarring. Outside, bulldozers leveled land. Inside, time itself was preserved behind protective glass. Luis Ortega noted shadows falling across the photographs, as if the past was trying to reach forward. Outside, cranes lifted steel beams for new structures, towers rising where rubble had lain. Workers paused to remove a cracked stone, unaware of its centuries-old craftsmanship. The city's voice was fragmented, whispers of memory against the roar of modernization. No one imagined this would become a Manila where history needed to fight for attention. Along Roxas Boulevard, old homes had been replaced with office towers, their glass facades reflecting the sun and distant waters. Pedestrians hurried past, oblivious to the ghosts of merchants, children, and streetcar conductors who once animated the streets. Luis Ortega walked slowly, notebook in hand, tracing lines where gardens and plazas had existed. Bulldozers churned over remnants of cobbled streets, scattering artifacts small and large, coins, toys, fragments of porcelain. Engineers measured new foundations, ensuring earthquake resilience, unaware of the layers of lives buried beneath. Carmen Rivera pointed to the location of an old school, now a parking lot, and whispered names of students lost to war. Children playing nearby stared at shadows cast by glass towers. The past reflected faintly in puddles and mirrors. The wind carried echoes of laughter and bells, faint but persistent. What they didn't yet know was that memory would persist quietly between lines of concrete and steel. In the old port district, salvaged timber from demolished warehouses was stacked in neat piles. Ships unloaded supplies for reconstruction, cranes swinging steadily, as if rehearsing a rhythm the city had forgotten. Archival footage of bustling docks played beside the scene, merchants shouting, ropes creaking, cargo nets swaying under sun. Workers paused as a historian traced a path where boats once unloaded rice, lumber, and textiles for a city now partially reborn. Children's laughter echoed faintly against metal beams, a small thread of continuity through time. Luis Ortega captured shadows of cranes overlaying faint imprints of old streets in puddles and dust. Mothers called to their children, cautioning them away from the sharp edges of steel and rubble. The city's energy returned incrementally, though each brick and beam whispered stories not yet told. No one imagined this would become a place where rebuilding required negotiation with ghosts. In a quiet alley behind the central market, remnants of old murals peeked through layers of peeling paint. Vivid colors, now dulled, depicted festivals, saints, and daily life, a silent testament to what once thrived here. Luis Ortega knelt, brushing dust from the surface, revealing details of hands, faces, and animals frozen in time. City planners debated street widening, unaware that this small fragment of mural connected generations. A child leaned against a new concrete wall, tracing patterns with fingertips, curiosity bridging centuries. Workers carried steel beams past, their feet kicking up dust that mingled with decades of soot. Photographers documented the juxtaposition, modernity encroaching upon memory. Archival images overlaid with the present revealed streets where life had pulsed strongly. What they didn't yet know was how resilience and history would coexist quietly in hidden corners. At the university, burned lecture halls had been cleared, modern classrooms installed in their place. Students filled these spaces, unaware of charred manuscripts that had once lined library shelves. Carmen Rivera guided a small group through a hallway, pausing at plaques commemorating lost scholars. Luis Ortega photographed the contrast, polished floors and steel desks over foundations that had witnessed fear, courage, and loss. Teachers recounted oral histories to students, threading memory through curriculum, fragile yet enduring. The hum of electricity and projectors replaced the crackle of fire, a subtle acknowledgement of time's passage. Windows framed sunlight onto new floors, highlighting shadows where desks had burned. Children's voices echoed faintly in corridors once silenced by war. No one imagined this would become a city where learning rose above the ashes. Along the northern suburbs, new roads cut through remnants of wartime ruins. Bulldozers leveled fragments of houses, yet careful surveyors noted the historical significance of certain walls and foundations. Luis Ortega traced the outline of a marketplace that had vanished, juxtaposed against GPS coordinates for planning. Archival footage overlaid new construction, reminding viewers of lives once bustling through narrow alleys. Carmen Rivera guided municipal planners, urging integration of memorial markers within the modern grid. Pedestrians paused at plaques, reading names of streets lost and rebuilt, connecting past with present. Children raced along sidewalks, unaware of the ghosts they passed. Engineers documented layers of soil and foundations, bridging modern design with historical awareness. What they didn't yet know was that memory could be preserved even as streets transformed. As dusk fell, Manila's skyline glowed with the sheen of modernity, steel and glass rising over the river. Fading photographs in museums and private homes glimmered faintly in the waning light, holding stories that machinery could not erase. Luis Ortega traced the river's edge, imagining trams gliding along avenues now lost to history. Carmen Rivera placed a final hand on a museum plaque, whispering names of merchants, children, and soldiers whose lives had once animated the city. Bulldozers rested, cranes paused, and a gentle wind carried dust and memory together. Pedestrians moved through streets that were both new and ancient, traces of the past visible in small details, a cobblestone here, a fragment of iron gate there. Photographers captured reflections in windows, echoing old facades now gone. Children's laughter mingled with faint whispers of history, bridging centuries in a single moment. Even memory can be rebuilt, brick by fragile brick. Dawn broke over Manila's northern cemetery, sunlight glinting off marble crosses standing in precise rows. Each stone bore a name, a date, a life condensed into letters carved with care. Luis Ortega traced his fingers along one inscription. Private Emilio Santos, 1945. Imagining the journey that led him here, a light mist curled across the ground, rising from dew and remembrance alike. Soldiers of past and present seemed to inhabit the silence between the rows, their footsteps muffled by soft grass. Voices whispered prayers, some in Tagalog, some in English, blending centuries of cultural memory. Candles flickered gently, their smoke rising, like faint signals across time. Nearby, chrysanthemums had been freshly placed, a tribute to those lost in flames and rubble. Archival footage of soldiers laying wreaths in 1946 dissolved into the present, uniting generations of grief and gratitude. What they didn't yet know was that these stones would become anchors for memory, keeping the past from drifting entirely away. At a Japanese shrine along the outskirts, incense spiraled upward, curling through early morning light. Visitors bowed, hands pressed together, offering quiet apologies for lives both given and taken. Lanterns swung gently in a soft breeze, casting long shadows over gravel paths. Luis Ortega captured the delicate choreography of ritual, a bow, a kneel, a whispered name. The names carved into stone echoed, Japanese soldiers from Manila, men whose orders wrought devastation, yet whose humanity remained recorded in memorial. Japanese historians noted the tension, remembrance for the fallen, acknowledgement of wrongs, the weight of collective conscience. Flowers were laid in careful symmetry, petals brushed with morning dew. Photographers documented the ritual, aware that each gesture told stories beyond words. Outside, city noise whispered faintly, a reminder that life moved forward, even amid solemnity. No one imagined this would become a place where former enemies met in quiet reverence. In the Bay District, a new memorial stood, steel and stone converging to form an abstract echo of destruction. Visitors paused before its curved walls, reading plaques listing civilians lost in February 1945. Carmen Rivera guided a tour, recounting names and stories, children listening intently, absorbing history's weight. Photographs of pre-war markets and post-war ruins were interspersed with modern steel frames, bridging memory and reality. Luis Ortega adjusted his lens to capture the interplay of sunlight and shadow, the sharpness of metal softened by human presence. Wreaths rested at the base, placed by veterans groups and families alike. Birds fluttered overhead, their wings brushing the air with a lightness that contrasted with heavy remembrance. Engineers ensured that the structure would withstand weather, time, and neglect, echoing the city's endurance. Visitors left small tokens, coins, flowers, and paper cranes. What they didn't yet know was how the architecture itself could hold both grief and hope. At the American cemetery in Fort Bonifacio, rows of white crosses stretched as far as the eye could see. Each represented a life, many young, some older, all interrupted by the logic of war. Luis Ortega walked slowly between rows, noting subtle differences, dog tags, engraved messages, personal touches left by families. A light drizzle began, coating uniforms and markers alike, creating a reflective sheen that mirrored the sky. A survivor, Esteban Cruz, placed flowers at his brother's grave, whispering in Tagalog and English. Archival footage from 1948 showed the first memorial ceremony, veterans saluting as the bugle played taps, merging past and present. Children followed their elders, learning the cadence of mourning and memory. Engineers maintained the grounds meticulously, understanding that the landscape itself preserved history. Soldiers standing guard were silent, as if listening to the voices of their predecessors. No one imagined this would become a place where loss and honor were inseparable. At Manila's walled city, Intramuros, a small plaque now commemorated the thousands lost amid stone and fire. Visitors traced fingers over engraved names, reading stories captured in short vignettes of courage, fear, and endurance. Luis Ortega captured the morning light striking the plaque, illuminating soot-stained walls behind it. A tour guide, Mateo de la Cruz, narrated the survival of convents and churches, the hidden basements where civilians waited in terror. Candles flickered on the steps, their light a soft contrast to the harsh scars of artillery pockmarks. The air smelled faintly of incense, dust, and damp stone. Archival images of the walled city before destruction were projected nearby, juxtaposed against present-day tranquility. Visitors paused, eyes glistening, absorbing the scale of both loss and resilience. What they didn't yet know was that the walls themselves could speak as eloquently as the names engraved upon them. Along the Pasig River, memorials marked civilian massacres, their surfaces smooth, cool, and unyielding. Water lapped gently against stone, reflecting sky and the occasional candle flame. Luis Ortega photographed reflections, capturing the duality: calm waters above, scars beneath. Survivors' families walked slowly, pointing out locations where homes once stood, recounting stories of hiding, loss, and survival. Archival footage of floating debris and rescuers searching the river dissolved into present serenity, though memory clung like fog. Engineers maintained pathways and steps, ensuring safe access without disturbing remnants below. Children released small paper boats, carrying names and prayers downstream. Photographers captured movement and stillness together, the river becoming both witness and participant. No one imagined this would become a place where water remembered as faithfully as stone. In cemeteries dedicated to Japanese soldiers, the morning sun lit rows of simple stones, each marked with kanji. Visitors knelt in quiet reflection, offering small tokens of rice, incense, and folded paper cranes. Luis Ortega observed the interplay of shadow and light across the stones, capturing reverence from both descendants and local citizens. Archival footage depicted similar ceremonies decades earlier, connecting generations across time. Guides explained the historical context, noting the duality of remembrance, honoring the dead while acknowledging deeds that wrought tragedy. Wind stirred leaves along pathways, the faint rustle mingling with whispered prayers. Caretakers tended plants, placing flowers meticulously, their hands tracing history as if healing it. Photographers captured these gestures with care, aware that every action carried layered significance. What they didn't yet know was how understanding could emerge quietly, in the space between grief and reconciliation. At sunset, all memorials glowed faintly under the fading light, casting long, contemplative shadows across grass and stone. Luis Ortega's camera captured marble, metal, and wood, each surface reflecting the journey of Manila's memory. Families lingered, some placing final flowers, others kneeling in silent tribute. Carmen Rivera recited the names of civilians and soldiers alike, blending language, culture, and history in a single breath. Birds circled overhead, their flight a soft punctuation to human reverence below. Archival footage of ceremonies, burials, and memorial placements dissolved into the present, merging memory and reality. Wind carried the faint scent of incense and flowers, mingling with Manila's tropical air. Photographers framed reflections in puddles, shadows of crosses against stone. Stone remembers what men try to forget. The sun slid low over the Pasig River, casting a long golden path across rippling water. Luis Ortega watched from a newly rebuilt bridge as boats drifted lazily, children laughing from their decks. The gentle lapping of water against hulls seemed to echo the soft cadence of the city's heartbeat, now steady and familiar. Lotus flowers floated serenely where debris had once churned during wartime floods of fire and smoke. Carmen Rivera traced her fingers along the railing, imagining the river during February 1945, when bodies, rubble, and artillery fragments clogged its waters. Small fish darted beneath floating petals, oblivious to the history that passed over them. Reflections of steel bridges shimmered alongside the silhouettes of palm trees, a juxtaposition of human rebuilding and natural constancy. Across the water, families picnicked where trenches had been, laughter threading through memory and reality. Archival photographs of wartime river crossings faded in her mind, replaced by calm motion and light. What they didn't yet know was how the river itself could witness both destruction and renewal. A fisherman adjusted his bamboo raft, pushing off gently into deeper water, sending ripples across the smooth surface. The currents carried fragments of history, small bits of old timber, remnants of war long buried, yet now life reclaimed every inch. Luis Ortega knelt at the riverbank, observing how lotus leaves emerged, bold and green, from soil once saturated with ash. Carmen Rivera recounted stories of families hiding in mangroves along the river's edge, children clinging to parents while shells exploded in distant streets. Ducks paddled near wooden pylons, indifferent to human memory, yet participating in the river's eternal continuity. Boats loaded with fruit and vegetables glided past, the air filled with shouts of vendors calling prices, echoing the marketplace, energy of pre-war Manila. Sunlight caught motes of dust in the air, golden like fleeting embers, reminding viewers that past and present overlap subtly. Bridges reflected perfectly in still pools between currents, mirroring both the sky above and shadows beneath. No one imagined this would become a river of life once more, carrying laughter instead of despair. Along the riverbanks, children kicked at the water, sending sprays sparkling into the evening air. Luis Ortega noted how their energy contrasted the quiet dignity of mangroves that had sheltered families decades before. Carmen Rivera pointed out plaques marking massacre sites, small reminders embedded into a landscape otherwise thriving. Boats passed silently, their oars slicing the surface with measured rhythm, displacing only water and memories. Birds wheeled above, circling patterns that had repeated for centuries, observing the city's rebirth from a distance. The smell of fresh water, mixed with jasmine from nearby gardens, creating a calm atmosphere that belied the river's violent past. Shopkeepers along the quay waved at children, their voices mingling with the river's gurgle and the faint hum of modern traffic. Archival images of wartime fires flashing across bridges contrasted sharply with the present placidity, underscoring nature's patient witness. Luis Ortega framed a photograph, capturing both ripple and reflection, time layered in a single frame. What they didn't yet know was that memory could flow as silently as water, yet remain indelible. A small canoe drifted past an old warehouse, now converted into a cultural center, its walls bearing murals of Manila before the war. Inside, children painted images of trams and bustling streets, translating stories of survival into color. Carmen Rivera described the warehouse's past, a place where civilians once hid, and Japanese soldiers had marched through, their boots scarring floors now restored. Outside, the river carried sunlight like liquid gold, brushing over the mural's reflections in the water. Luis Ortega noted the precision of oar strokes against gentle currents, the energy of life undisturbed, yet aware of the river's witness. Mango trees lined the shore, their shade providing respite for families reading memorial plaques, the river murmuring beneath. Archival footage of retreating troops and floating debris seemed to coexist with the current scene, bridging the past with present peace. Children's laughter mingled with water lapping softly against stilts and piers. No one imagined this would become a river of memory, holding both tragedy and renewal in every ripple. At the confluence where the Pasig met Laguna de Bay, the water widened, carrying light and shadow across the horizon. Luis Ortega watched a boat of elderly couples drifting, their faces etched with decades of experience, some survivors, some descendants of those who fled the flames. Carmen Rivera described how families once hid along this bend, the river their lifeline, fragile, yet essential. Kingfishers darted between reeds, indifferent to human conflict, yet their flight mirrored the persistence of life. Wooden barges, carrying fish and rice, traced patterns long used by generations, unchanged despite upheaval. Sunlight struck the water at an angle that revealed traces of submerged foundations, remnants of buildings flattened by bombs. A light wind rustled the reeds, creating faint music, as if the river itself remembered lullabies once sung by mothers in hiding. Luis Ortega captured the interplay of reflection and movement, highlighting the river's dual role as witness and participant. What they didn't yet know was how enduring the river's memory truly was, embracing sorrow and hope in equal measure. In the evening glow, the skyline of modern Manila reflected on the water's surface, buildings rising like silent sentinels. Boats moved calmly, children waved, and fishermen readied nets, carrying the legacy of those who had once relied on the river for survival. Carmen Rivera traced the course of wartime paths in her mind, noting locations of ambushes, crossings, and hidden tunnels. Luis Ortega framed the reflection of a steel bridge in a photograph, the smooth surface mirroring both sky and memory. Families picnicked along the banks where trenches and shelters had once been, small markers now commemorating lives lost. Birds called faintly, wings cutting the amber light, adding to the river's soundtrack of continuity. A gentle breeze carried the scent of lotus and fresh water, mingling with faint city aromas. Archival footage faded in and out, layered over current movement, the river's flow connecting past and present. No one imagined this would become a river of solace, holding both grief and laughter in its passage. Near the Manila Yacht Club, sails glinted in the last rays of sun, their movement smooth against the calm river. Luis Ortega captured children pointing at reflections, mistaking their own faces for those of ancestors. Carmen Rivera recounted how this section once floated with debris from fire and artillery, now replaced by leisure and life. Ducks paddled past wooden piers, indifferent yet part of the river's ongoing story. Small boats carried vendors selling fruits, their voices mingling with faint hums of commuters along distant bridges. Shadows lengthened across water, reflecting the city's resilience in delicate patterns. Archival images of the same stretch showed devastation, smoke rising, and chaos, now replaced by gentle currents and human activity. Flowers drifted downstream in small paper boats, children and adults placing them with soft prayers. What they didn't yet know was that time had softened the river's scars, even as it carried memory forward. As twilight descended, lanterns along the riverbank glimmered like stars fallen to water, reflecting both city and sky. Luis Ortega photographed the final ripples of day, capturing boats drifting lazily past rebuilt bridges. Carmen Rivera paused, watching lotus flowers float beside the river, their petals glowing faintly in the fading light. Families lingered, children laughing softly, echoing past sounds of survival, transformed into joy. Ducks glided between floating reflections, joining the river's song of continuity. Archival footage flickered in her mind. Shells, fire, debris, now replaced by calm waters and enduring bridges. The breeze carried the faint scent of incense from nearby memorials, mingling history with the present. Shadows deepened across the water, elongating reflections of people, trees, and structures alike. The river flows on, carrying memory in every ripple. The sun dipped behind Manila's skyline, brushing glass towers and concrete spires with a golden, fleeting light. Children ran across open plazas, where artillery had once thundered, their laughter weaving through air thick with centuries of history. Pedicabs rattled along streets that had been lined with sandbags and barbed wire just decades before. Carmen Rivera paused on the bridge, overlooking the Pasig, tracing her eyes along the calm water where fire and smoke had once swirled. Old Spanish churches punctuated the cityscape, their walls reflecting the hues of sunset, silent witnesses to both destruction and rebirth. Vendors closed stalls, their calls replaced by the gentle hum of evening traffic and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Luis Ortega photographed the scene, capturing both movement and stillness in a single frame, the city alive yet contemplative. Lanterns flickered along riverbanks, echoing the soft rhythm of twilight. A stray dog wandered through a quiet alley, sniffing remnants of history embedded in cracked stone. What they didn't yet know was how the weight of memory could settle into calm, carrying both grief and grace. From Intramuros, a lone church bell tolled, its sound resonating over rooftops and alleyways alike. Mothers called their children inside, the familiar cadence grounding daily life amidst layers of past turmoil. Carmen Rivera noted the faint outline of ruined walls, remnants preserved in corners, now shadowed by modern streets. The wind carried faint traces of incense from memorials, mingling with scents of street food and freshly laundered clothes. Luis Ortega paused, observing commuters crossing bridges, unaware of the battles once waged beneath their feet. Bicycles spun past, tires humming over cobblestones that had survived shelling and fire. The Pasig shimmered, reflecting the orange and pink horizon, carrying memories like sediment beneath calm waters. Photographs of pre-war Manila, juxtaposed with post-war reconstructions, whispered stories of resilience in quiet tones. The city breathed softly, a living testament to survival layered over loss. No one imagined this would become a place where silence itself carried remembrance. In a small plaza, an elderly man fed pigeons where soldiers once waited for orders, rifles slung over tired shoulders. Children mimicked his movements, scattering seeds while laughing, unaware that centuries of history coursed beneath their feet. Carmen Rivera recalled his name, Don Emilio Cruz, a survivor who had hidden in basements during the Battle of Manila. The wind brushed through trees, carrying the faint scent of lotus from a nearby riverbank, flowers blooming where debris once floated. A tram rolled along tracks, rebuilt from remnants of old rails, its bell clanging softly as if marking the passage of time. Luis Ortega captured the scene, juxtaposing the innocence of play against lingering echoes of past chaos. Birds wheeled overhead, their flight tracing arcs once shadowed by aerial dogfights and gunfire. Shops closed shutters for the evening, murals on walls celebrating cultural rebirth, glinting in the dying sunlight. Mothers and fathers paused to watch children, their gaze reflecting memory and hope intertwined. What they didn't yet know was that life itself could rewrite the scars of history with quiet persistence. Along the rebuilt coastline, fishermen hauled nets where the bay had once been strewn with debris and ash. The water glinted, reflecting cranes and modern docks. Yet below the surface, remnants of war remained, twisted metal, faint echoes of fire. Carmen Rivera watched a young boy skip stones, measuring distances, with the precision of someone who never knew fear. Luis Ortega photographed the reflections of cranes and palm trees, light dancing across water that had witnessed both destruction and recovery. Seagulls wheeled above, their cries mingling with distant church bells and the muted hum of city life. A ferry crossed quietly, passengers immersed in conversation, oblivious to the buried stories beneath. The air smelled faintly of fish, salt, and the warmth of late afternoon sun. Bridges arched gracefully over the river, now carrying pedestrians instead of tanks. Shadows lengthened across the water, blurring lines between history and present day. No one imagined this would become a river of stories, flowing silently beneath lives that carried on. At dusk, the city's golden haze softened into violet and indigo, casting long, gentle shadows across rooftops. Carmen Rivera traced the outlines of old Spanish forts, now partially reconstructed, imagining them once full of soldiers and tension. Luis Ortega noted the contrast between past and present, where peace seemed almost fragile but undeniably enduring. Families picnicked near the riverbanks, children playing, elders watching, stories of survival whispered between generations. The scent of jasmine mixed with the faint smoke of evening cooking fires, blending memory and modern life. A street musician's violin sang faintly, notes resonating as if tuned to the heartbeat of the city itself. Lanterns reflected off calm waters, echoing the candlelight once used in basements by those hiding from artillery. Photographs of wartime ruins lay in museums nearby, juxtaposed against murals celebrating rebirth and cultural memory. Pigeons cooed softly from cathedral spires, joining the chorus of human and natural rhythms. What they didn't yet know was that the city could speak without words, telling its story in light, shadow, and quiet. In a quiet alley, sunlight filtered through leaves, casting intricate patterns on cracked cobblestones once scarred by gunfire. Luis Ortega observed children tracing lines in the dust, drawing homes and ships, unknowingly echoing sketches from wartime notebooks. Carmen Rivera recited fragments from letters recovered decades ago, their inked words soft yet undiminished by time. Laundry hung gently in the evening breeze, flapping over buildings once used as temporary barracks. Motorbikes hummed past, mixing with birdsong, a symphony of renewal atop layers of memory. Elderly couples strolled slowly, holding hands, their faces mapping decades of survival. A stray cat crossed a doorway, pausing to observe a discarded wartime helmet left as a memorial. The river beyond glimmered with reflections of lamplights, a living mirror of resilience. Luis Ortega captured the scene, the camera a bridge between memory, narrative, and observation. No one imagined this would become a city where the past is honored softly beneath everyday life. From a rooftop, the modern skyline stretched, its lights flickering like stars brought to earth. Carmen Rivera reflected on Manila's endurance, from colonial ports to wartime infernos, now glowing beneath a tranquil sky. Children chased each other, their movements tracing arcs once shadowed by soldiers' rifles and explosions. The air smelled faintly of roasted corn from street vendors, blending normalcy with the weight of history. Luis Ortega photographed reflections in puddles, capturing city lights mirrored alongside ripples of past memory. A bell tolled in the distance, marking both time and remembrance, echoing softly over quiet streets. Birds wheeled in fading light, their flight patterns intersecting with electric cables and tree branches alike. Shadows deepened across plazas where old murals celebrated both loss and resilience. What they didn't yet know was that the city's spirit had woven itself into every street, bridge, and riverbank. Night fell gently, casting Manila, under a quilt of soft indigo and silver, lights twinkling like stars scattered across the land. Luis Ortega adjusted his camera one last time, capturing the city's stillness, where echoes of history floated invisibly in the air. Carmen Rivera watched children yawning, returning home along streets that had seen fire, fear, and now laughter. The church bell tolled again, low and resonant, mingling with distant traffic, river currents, and soft night breezes. Lanterns along bridges glimmered faintly, reflecting the quiet diligence of human endurance. Pigeons perched silently on parapets, witnesses to centuries of both triumph and tragedy. The skyline shimmered in the distance, blending steel, glass, and ancient stone into a harmonious silhouette. Families gathered at windows, the warmth of home contrasting the cold memory of war etched into walls. Tonight the city sleeps beneath the quiet sky, and in its dreams remembers,